Chapter 603. I caught a cold and fell ill from the rain yesterday. I'll find an opportunity to make up for the 2 missing chapters in the next few days. The Crimson family's Magi, led by Grimm, watched the entire battle from the sidelines. Looking at the large and plump body of the Tier 3 dragon, looking at the thick and terrifying dragon breath, looking at the robust figure that transformed into a human and slaughtered everything in its path, all of the Crimson family's Magi felt their hearts tighten. Fortunately, Gazruvi was not weak. Moreover, this was his home ground. After a few failed attempts, the fire dragoness flew back into the depths of the Stoneclaw Mountains in a fit of rage. From the looks of it, the fire dragoness was already engaged in a battle with the Metal Fortress and would not leave the Stoneclaw Mountains anytime soon. Similar battles would continue to occur. With this, it would be extremely dangerous for the Crimson family Magi to move around the Metal Fortress. After all, if they encountered the fire dragoness in the wild, even Tier 1 Magi would be killed instantly. Without some special means, they would not even be able to keep their lives. As for the Tier 2 Magi in the family, Mary could definitely escape unscathed with her super high agility. Grimm, on the other hand, could barely escape with his life if he paid a certain price. Only Draconid Zachary, if he encountered the fire dragoness, would have no other ending than death. Although there was a Tier 2 dragon devourer, Olivia, hidden in the Metal Fortress, with her strength, the success rate of ambushing a Tier 2 dragon was rather high. However, if she tried to ambush a fire dragon, which was known for its powerful combat power, she would be overestimating herself. Once the ambush failed, the fire dragon Lady Felaba would spread the news of the dragon devourer's existence. The originally lazy and selfish dragons would immediately gather together and attack Grimm's Metal Fortress. At that time, the fortress would not be able to escape. No matter how strong the Metal Fortress's defenses were, how many dragons could it withstand? So long as 5 or more Tier 3 dragons wreaked havoc around the fortress, the mana furnace would no longer be able to keep up with its energy consumption. At that time, the fortress would no longer be able to accumulate as much mana as it currently did. When that time came, the dragons would just have to be smart and take turns to fight, constantly provoking the Metal Fortress to fire its powerful cannons. With the mana stored within the Metal Fortress, it would not be able to sustain a prolonged battle. Without the support of massive magical energy, the Metal Fortress would be nothing more than a pile of metal. No matter how strong the outer wall of the Metal Fortress was, it could not withstand the powerful dragon breath and sharp fangs and claws of the giant dragons. That was why the Crimson family was still unable to carry out large-scale development in Lance under their own banner. All of their movements had to be hidden within the Metal Fortress to prevent them from attracting terrifying enemies that they couldn't defeat. The Crimson family was like a ferocious beast that hid its fangs and claws, not daring to show its ferocity in front of others. Grimm hesitated over and over again for a native giant dragon lord like Fire Dragon Girl, but he could only let her continue to be arrogant and despotic. It couldn't be helped. With the current strength of the Crimson family, even if the dragon devourer Olivia cooperated fully, they still wouldn't have a chance of killing the Fire Dragon Girl. Therefore, in order to avoid alerting the enemy, the Metal Fortress under Gazruvi's control could only show a posture of having more than enough defense but not enough offense, in order to numb the arrogant and fierce Fire Dragon Girl. Though the auction organized by the Blazing Flame Monarch had ended on bad terms due to Mega Sinazar, the Crimson family's reputation still spread far and wide. The coordinates of Lance in the minds of the Draconians and dragons that were sold by Grimm's hand had been erased, so it would not affect his monopolization of Lance in any way. The Crimson family also used this opportunity to convert the resources they seized from the goblins and Lance into more practical magic crystals. This made Grimm, who had always been careful not to be extravagant, feel rich for the first time. To be honest, the magnificent sight of more than 2 million magic crystals pouring out of his spatial ring and piling up into a magic crystal mountain left even Grimm dumbfounded. He held his breath, not daring to exhale for a long time. His performance was actually not bad. After all, he had seen an even larger magic crystal mountain in the Tower of Destiny. It was a sealed environment, and even a natural spirit had been born there. However, the other magi of the Crimson family had all turned into idiots with their eyes narrowed to the size of crystals. They rushed to the magic crystal mountain, touching everything here and there, laughing maniacally. They were just short of rolling around on top of it. Gargamel and the forest demon Ava's precious daughter had plunged into the magic crystal mountain, and Ava could not pull her out no matter how hard she tried. However, Grimm could clearly see that the little girl called Amelia was stuffing magic crystals into her mouth with all her might, munching on them with crunchy crunches. Faced with this scene, Grimm was speechless. Though magic crystals were not as sturdy as magic weapons, they were not something normal people could easily break. But now, a 5- or 6-year-old girl was chewing on it like candy. That kind of strange and inexplicable feeling was really hard to conceal. This little girl was definitely not human. Although she had the same body and appearance as a human little girl, her behavior was still similar to that of a monster. When human magi absorbed magic crystals, they would hold them in their hands and slowly absorb them. Only powerful monsters would directly devour them to absorb the pure energy within. After all, humans were not magical creatures. They had to use a gentler and gentler method to absorb this energy, so as to reduce the impact of the external magic energy on their bodies. Monsters were closer to the origin of the plane, and their bodies were much stronger than humans. Thus, their tolerance for magic was much higher than that of humans. Amelia's actions completely proved that she was a monster's soul. Perhaps they had already accepted this reality, but Gargamel and the forest demon Ava did not seem to notice Amelia's actions. Instead, they still doted on her. This made Grimm feel speechless. However, Amelia's growth potential was indeed astonishing. It had only been a few days, and her spiritual force had grown by quite a bit. From the looks of it, it was only a matter of time before the Crimson family gained another wizard. Over the next few days, the Crimson family once again recruited a batch of wandering wizards to maintain the operations of the Blazing Flame Monarch. With Gargamel and the forest demon Ava in charge of guarding the wizard's pagoda, along with Sharon and the 3-headed magic hound Angua, as well as an additional 50 magical machines, the safety of the wizard's pagoda was not a problem. This way, the freed wizards of the Crimson family could be successfully sent to the Gnome Dimension and Lance Dimension to expand the family's businesses. Most of the Level 1 wizards were left in the Gnome Dimension. On one hand, it was to deter the Gnome royal family, and on the other, it was to conduct cross-dimensional trade with the Gnome Tycoons and Merchant Group. What the wizards could provide were wizard items and all sorts of unique items that the Gnome Dimension did not possess. Even though there would be a slight loss of wizard power in the Gnome Dimension, and their effects would be slightly reduced, they would not lose all their functions. On the other hand, what the gnomes could provide were all sorts of special metals or large amounts of commonly used metal ores, or special plants and animals found in the Gnome Dimension. As for the exchange rate, there was no universal value system to compare it with, so it was more random most of the time. For example, the blood sacks and blood crystals that wizards brought from the sorcerer world could instantly replenish a large amount of blood energy, which was why the gnomes viewed them as the #1 treasure that could save their lives. Magical creature materials like these could be exchanged for several kilograms of special metals or hundreds of tons of ordinary metal ores. Every high-quality blood crystal could be exchanged for tens or even hundreds of ogres. If these rare resources could be transported back to the sorcerer world, the Crimson family could exchange them for thousands of magical crystals. Thousands of magical crystals could be used to buy cheaper blood sacks and blood crystals. Thus, as long as the core of the dimensional trade was in the hands of the Crimson family, large amounts of magical crystals would continuously flow into the pockets of their wizards. Thus, although being stationed in a foreign dimension was a very dry and tedious task, it allowed the magi stationed there to become very rich. In particular, with the cooperation of the gnome Great Sage Kabi and the gnome War God Tygol, the Crimson family specifically introduced a life extension potion, which immediately caused quite a stir within the gnome empire. The life extension potion was only a mid-grade potion in the Magus world, and any potion master could smoothly concoct it. The main ingredient used was a strange plant from the Elven clan, Nature Fruit. This life extension potion could only extend one's natural lifespan for 3 to 6 years, and it could not be used repeatedly. Thus, the price-performance ratio was not high, and Magi did not pay much attention to it. Even in the Magus world, this potion only had a market in the circles of the rich and powerful. But in the gnome dimension, this cheap life extension potion had become a godly medicine that all the gnome nobles fought over, and the price was inflated to an astonishing level. There was no helping it. The average human magi in the Magus world had a lifespan of 200 to 300 years, and an extra 3 to 5 years was nothing to them. But in the gnome dimension, the average lifespan was only 50 to 60 years, which was less than half that of humans. Under these circumstances, the price-performance ratio of 5 years of natural lifespan was naturally many times higher. This was especially true for the large corporations and merchant groups that occupied various parts of the gnome dimension. Their leaders behind the scenes were all old and on the verge of death. At this time, someone told them that they could live for another 5 years, and in these 5 years, they would be as strong and energetic as young gnomes, which goblin ruler would be able to resist such an extreme temptation. Chapter 604. Dalka was restless these days. As the young ice dragon Lord Alantini's draconian slave, Dalka's main responsibility was to take care of his territory while his master was asleep. In the past 200 to 300 years, Dalka had always done well, very well. He had even been praised by the Dragon Lord for his work. Today, however, this loyal Tier 2 dragonoid was feeling vexed. What bothered him was that something big seemed to have happened in the Stoneclaw Mountains thousands of kilometers away. The Wind Dragon Lord, Chax, disappeared inexplicably, and a strange army of magic weapons suddenly occupied its territory. The reason why they were called an army and not a tribe was because they were not real living beings. They were just a group of puppets under someone's control. However, from the way they fought, it could be seen that there was a powerful commander standing behind them, who could control every single one of them as if they were his own arm. Dalka had heard a lot of rumors, and the most common one was that this group of metal magical machines was a kind of metal life that could continuously devour the metal veins under the Stoneclaw Mountains to continue growing. Of course, there were also many rumors that described them as invaders from another world, and the metal puppets were just their peripheral forces. Having heard so many similar rumors, Dalka's limited brain capacity had become a little sluggish. After hesitating countless times, he did not summon the courage to go to Lord Alantini's bedroom to wake him up. First, everything he had heard was just rumors. If he rashly woke up the Ice Dragon Lord with these unconfirmed rumors, he would not end up well. Second, Dalka did not have any actual evidence to prove that the metal monsters would invade the Ice Dragon territory. The giant dragons each occupied their own territory and did not care about other people's business in their dragon territory. Even if the Wind Dragon Chax's territory was turned upside down by the metal puppets, Lord Alantini would not frown. Instead, he would smile and wait for the next gathering of the giant dragons to mock Chax. Therefore, as long as the metal monsters stayed in the Stoneclaw Mountains, they would only harm the Wind Dragon Chax. What did it have to do with him? If that Wind Dragon Chax had the ability, he could call on his friends, or run back to his family and ask the elders to back him up. If he wasn't capable enough, he deserved to have his territory taken away by a bunch of otherworld dead souls and become the first low-class dragon in Lance to lose his territory and wander around. At that time, it would also become the target of ridicule at the giant dragon's gathering. As for the territory that it had lost, if the Ice Dragon Alantini could defeat the metal monster and take it back, The ownership of the territory would belong to the ice dragon. However, with the dragon's usual lazy and slow pace, they would probably have to wait until Alantini had a sweet sleep and had her fill before she would have the time and mood to deal with these trivial matters that had nothing to do with pain or itch. Before that, anyone who disturbed Ice Dragon's sweet dreams would incur her wrath. Meanwhile, the rage of a Tier 2 Ice Dragon Lord was extremely frightening. At the very least, the dozens of lifelike ice sculptures erected in front of Alantini's bedroom were the most direct proof. They weren't the ice sculptures of craftsmen who poured their blood, sweat, and tears into them. Instead, they were living creatures that angered the ice dragon and were frozen by her terrifying ice dragon breath. Of course, there were also Dalka's predecessors, ex-predecessors, and ex-predecessors. All of them, without exception, foolishly awakened the Ice Dragon Lord at a time when they shouldn't have. The bedroom of the Tier 2 Ice Dragon Alantini was located on a tall, lonely peak. Pure white snow piled up to form a huge, sparkling palace. Cold, dry air swirled in the square in front of the palace, letting out sharp and terrifying whistles from time to time. Pure white clouds floated halfway up the lonely peak, blocking the exuberant curiosity of mortals who wanted to peek into the ice dragon's bedroom. There were only a few days in a year when the north wind at high altitudes would tear apart all the floating clouds. Under the bright sunlight, the towering mountain peak and the splendid golden walls of the ice dragon's sleeping quarters would briefly appear in front of people, causing them to gasp in admiration and be fascinated by it. Most of the time, the ice dragon's chambers were hidden in dense mist and ice crystals, guarded by more than 100 ice-type draconids day and night in shift. As for the other draconians and scouts, they were sent to various parts of the ice dragon territory to collect rations, taxes, or conscription every year. Large amounts of resources and materials would gather here, becoming the personal wealth of the Dragon Lord. The Draconians, on the other hand, were the personal servants, warriors, and treasure guards of the Dragon Lord. The two tall Draconian warriors standing in front of the door of the Ice Dragon's bedroom held frost longswords in their hands and frost bows on their back. Their sturdy bodies stood tall, their 4 thick dragon legs standing perfectly straight. They stared with their 2 big and 2 small dragon eyes, scanning the crisscrossing ice peaks and forests around them. However, they did not dare to look at the leader of the Draconians, the Tier 2 Draconian warrior Dalka, who had been loitering in front of the door for half a day. He had been here for a long time, yet he did not dare to take a step into the ice palace. His hesitation and anxiety could be seen. However, even though they sympathized with their leader, the 2 Draconians looked straight ahead, not daring to strike up a conversation with him or console him. Their duty was to protect the ice dragon, not allowing outsiders to disturb his slumber. However, they did not have the obligation to wake him up. On the entire lonely peak, only the leader of the Draconians, Dalka, had the authority to enter the ice palace. This was a form of authority, but also a form of torment. At least, Dalka was feeling tormented now. The chilly air current brushed past the crisscrossing ice pillars, letting out a bone-chilling, ear-piercing whistle. But strangely, this air current was mixed with a strange smell, a smell that should not have appeared here. Dalka, who was walking back and forth in annoyance, suddenly stopped. He raised his nose and sniffed a few times. Floral scent. A strange floral scent. Along with the fragrance of the flowers came an inexplicable dizziness and a strange sense of powerlessness. The floral scent was poisonous. Dalka lifted his head in shock and realized that the entrance of the bedroom was shrouded by a translucent elemental light membrane. And he was within it. Soundproof barrier. Dalka was the leader of the Draconians after all. He instantly recognized the essence of this strange elemental light membrane. This was a soundproof barrier that could block all sounds. As long as one was shrouded by the light membrane, no matter how loud the commotion inside was, no one outside would be able to hear anything. Just as Dalka realized that something was wrong, the two draconians standing guard at the entrance of the ice palace began to sway unsteadily. Their powerful draconians allowed them to withstand the mysterious floral poison. However, it also made their limbs weak, and they couldn't unleash their full strength. At the same time, a red figure descended from the sky at lightning speed. The blood-red longbow in his hand shot out dozens of blood-red arrows, aiming for Dalka's vital points. On the ground, the tall and mighty draconian Zachary removed his invisibility spell. His heavy footsteps rumbled as he charged towards Darka, whose face was filled with shock like a steel chariot. Both the sky and the ground attacked at the same time. Moreover, the attackers were all Tier 2 experts of the same tier. Dalka, who was still in a state of shock, couldn't even unsheathe the frost sword at his waist. He could only engage in close combat with the two attackers with his bare fist. While the three people were fighting, Poison Centipede Ender, Insect Lich Bliss, Wind Lich Decella, and Medusa formed a strangulation team and engaged the two draconians at the entrance of the bedroom. The two draconians were undoubtedly the elites of the draconians, since they were chosen to guard Lord Ice Dragon's bedroom. Unfortunately, Poison Centipede Ender had poisoned them first, while the other two sorcerers of the same tier attacked them from behind. The Crimson family's sorcerers had made all sorts of preparations for this ambush. They even brought along frost amulets and resistance rings. Under such circumstances, even if the draconians had powerful strength and combat instincts, they could only die regretfully at the hands of the Crimson family's sorcerers. One of the draconians was pierced by Insect Lich Bliss's Scorpion Legion before being poisoned to death by Poison Centipede Ender. On the other hand, the other dragonoid warrior was petrified by Medusa at close range before being sliced into countless pieces by the wind wizard Decella. By the time the battle ended, the outcome of the battle between the Tier 2 draconians had already been decided. The Tier 2 draconians, Dalka, had died. Mary was heavily injured, while Zakar suffered light injuries. However, after Zakar consumed a few healing potions, coupled with the draconian's strong regenerative abilities, his injuries were no longer a problem. As for the Blood Queen, Mary, who was the main force in the battle, she suffered the heaviest injuries. However, when she lay down on Dalka's mangled body and sucked a few mouthfuls of blood, the horrifying injuries on her body healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. At this moment, Grim and Alina appeared together. One of the reasons they did not take action was because Mary and Zakar were more than enough to deal with this Tier 2 draconians. The other reason was that Grim's attacks were full of sound and light effects. The silence barrier could only block sound, but it could not block vibrations and light. Therefore, in order not to alarm the draconians in the camp at the foot of the mountain, Grim could only act as late as possible. As for Alina, she was not one of Grim's direct subordinates. She was just a strategic ally. Hence, the appearance fee for her to act was too high. He could only use her Dragonslayer sword in the most suitable place. Chapter 605. It had to be said that the rank 2 ice dragon Alantini had decorated her bedroom beautifully. The tall and majestic palace, the spacious and bright hall, the exquisite murals, and the dazzling furnishings. However, all of this was covered in a layer of ice, giving off a strange feeling of bone-chilling coldness. After passing through a long and straight corridor, the group finally entered the ice dragon Alantini's world of ice and snow. The first thing they saw was a majestic palace, with a huge platform above it. From the looks of it, it seemed to be the seat the ice dragon had arranged for itself. When it was not asleep, it would spend most of its time lying lazily on the platform, quietly enjoying the service of the Dragonians. It would either eat and drink to its heart's content, or summon some foreign singers and dancers to add to the fun. As for the internal affairs of the territory, the dragons would never bother to care about those unimportant things. Since there were loyal Draconid servants in charge of the management, the Dragon Lord only had to enjoy himself in peace, patrol his territory from time to time, and proclaim his might to the foolish natives. Of course, as a female rank 2 ice dragon, Alantini was neither as lascivious as the fire dragon lady, nor as diligent in government affairs as the wind dragon Chax. She was just an ordinary dragon who knew her place. Hence, her territory was not big, only about 200 to 300 kilometers. With the speed of a rank 2 ice dragon, it would only take half a day to circle around the border of the territory. There were many ice-type magical creatures living in her territory, such as the ice banshee, the berserk snowman, the ice worm, and the blue devil. Although the dragons in the surrounding territories were much stronger than her, the ice dragon territory was a world of ice and snow, with bone-chilling winds. Hence, very few of them had any designs on her. Thus, Alantini lived happily in this kingdom of ice and snow, enjoying a peaceful life for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, the tranquility of this world of ice and snow was completely broken by a group of outsiders today. Walking in the world of ice and snow made entirely of ice crystals and icicles, every magus was excited and nervous. Dragon Slayer. What a stirring word and phrase! Countless human warriors were willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of this illusory glory. They bravely faced the terrifying giant dragon, all so that they could add the prefix Dragon Slayer in front of their surnames. In this way, even if he died of old age in the future, the title of Dragon Slayer would be passed down for thousands of years. However, for Grimm, although slaying a dragon was not as easy as killing a kitten or a puppy, it was not as difficult as ascending to the heavens for an ordinary human. He did not have to put in a lot of effort to fight for that tiny chance of success. The successful capture of the wind dragon, Chax, meant that the Crimson family's Tier 2 battle team had taken shape, and they already possessed the strength to slay dragons. Although a large part of their strength was due to luck, it was enough to prove that they had the basic combat power to face a Tier 2 dragon. Hence, after investigating and analyzing the nests and basic combat power of the 3 Tier 2 dragon lords in the vicinity, Grimm decided to go all out. On the 6th day after the Crimson family's public appearance, he led a group of subordinates to slay the dragons. In order to capture this Tier 2 ice dragon, Grimm and the rest had put in a lot of effort and preparation. Just the equipment that increased ice resistance cost 70,000 to 80,000 magic crystals. Everyone had also prepared 3 bottles of cold resistance potions that could temporarily reduce ice damage, which cost another 50,000 magic crystals. As for the anti-prophecy wands, invisibility scrolls, ice-melting potions, mental defense potions, and other miscellaneous items, Grimm had also spent 40,000 magic crystals. In order to equip Zacha, who was a super meat shield, Grimm had specially bought him a set of ice armor and 2 enchanted shields, which could help him resist most ice damage. In order to slay the dragons, the Crimson family had invested close to 300,000 magic crystals on the ice dragon Alantini. If they failed to slay the dragons, the Crimson family would not only lose the 300,000 magic crystals, but they would also have to face the loss of their members. The latter was actually what every Magus family was most worried about and did not want to see. After passing through the hall, everyone walked towards the path that led to the ice dragon's bedroom. All the Grade 1 Magi stayed behind and began to set up various spell formations to prevent the ice dragon from receiving any help when the battle began. After all, the people participating in the battle were all Grade 2 Magi, and the commotion caused would not be small. If the Dragonborn camp sensed that something was amiss and sent a large number of Dragonborn warriors to their aid, the 4 Magi would be responsible for blocking them for a while. That way, even though they did not have to face the terrifying Grade 2 Ice Dragon, they might have to face a large group of Dragonborn Berserk. The danger did not decrease much, but they still had to be careful. As they got closer to the Ice Dragon's bedroom, the faint sound of an icy wind could be heard in the icy mountain path. The bone-chilling wind was mixed with a trace of the dragon's scale aura. The smell was thick and fishy, making people feel nauseous. As an experienced Tier 2 sorcerer, Grim knew very well that the howling wind coming towards him was not natural. It was the powerful ice dragon's breath that was formed when it was sleeping. Judging from this, the ice dragon did not seem to notice the enemy's approach and was still sleeping soundly. However, when Dragonman Zacha, who was walking in the front, entered a straight ice tunnel, he took a step forward, and the ice under his feet suddenly let out a clear cracking sound. The sound was not loud, but it was ear-piercing in the silent ice palace where only the sound of the wind could be heard. Along with the shattering of the ice crystal, they also sensed a subtle magical fluctuation. Crap, it's a magic trap. Grim made a decision in an instant. Don't hesitate, charge. Following Grim's command, Draconid Zachary drew out a gigantic tower shield from his back that was large enough to cover half of his body. He raised his neck and let out a long roar, before raising the shield and rushing into the depths of the tunnel. The tunnel, which was covered by a thin layer of ice, suddenly flashed with magical light. As the hidden magic traps were triggered, the ice walls, the floor, and the ceiling all spat out countless white streams of freezing air. Streaks of formed ice magic gushed out, slamming towards Zacha the Dragonman, who was charging forward like a storm, like a tide of ice. Holding the shield high, a milky white halo of ice shone around Zacha's body. He gulped down 2 bottles of ice-melting potion in one go, and only then did Zacha not get frozen in place by the tidal wave of freezing air. The muscles on his arms bulged, and he unleashed 2 bursts of strength in a row. Only then did he continue to run forward against the cold wave. Grim, Mary, and Olivia hid behind Zacha, avoiding the direct impact of the cold wave. In this extremely cold space, if their strength and physique were slightly weaker, they would be frozen in place by the omnipresent frost power. In order to save energy, the 3 of them grabbed Zacha's dragon tail and borrowed its incomparably violent strength. Only then did they manage to rush through the tunnel without any mishaps. Within the ice palace, the cold wind suddenly became rapid and violent. The ice dragon is awakening. Once she's fully awake, it won't be easy for us to launch a surprise attack. Olivia, who had a petite figure but was extremely experienced in slaying dragons, exclaimed in a low voice. Hearing her words, Zacha once again unleashed his strength. His huge body suddenly accelerated, and like a rumbling war chariot that was out of control, he charged straight into the ice dragon's bedroom with a wild momentum. The magic traps that the ice dragon had set up in the tunnel might have been able to kill the ordinary thieves, but they obviously could not do anything to Grim and the others who were already prepared. However, if Grim and the others were entangled in the traps for too long, they would have to face a terrifying dragon that was fully prepared to attack when they arrived at the ice dragon's bedroom. But now they did not hesitate to risk their lives and rushed through this dangerous journey in one breath. When they arrived in front of the ice dragon, the giant dragon that was covered in translucent white dragon scales had just opened its eyes. Its amber dragon eyes were filled with terrifying majesty, but they were still filled with confusion and chaos. Although it had already sensed that the magic traps outside the bedroom had been triggered, it still needed some time to break free from the deepest slumber. Hence, when Ice Dragon Alantini opened her sleepy eyes, the first thing she saw was a violent figure that was as huge as a steel war chariot. Under her terrified gaze, a giant tower shield grew in size and occupied more than half of Alantini's field of vision. It fiercely smashed into her nose. A wool blood spurted out from her nose and the pain was intense. Alantini let out a mournful roar, completely shaking off the fatigue and laziness after a long period of sleep. She instantly woke up. Just as she straightened her graceful and smooth body, 3 short ants suddenly rushed out from behind that huge body, and at the same time, the most terrifying attacks poured down on the elegant and beautiful body of the ice dragon. Torrent of flames plus explosive rune. Continuous blood slash plus shadow strike. Tendon break plus eviscerate plus sinister strike. The 3 terrifying enemies contributed 3 completely different attacking methods. Grimm was still using his most proficient and powerful rank 2 fire element spell, Torrent of Flames, which was a condensed elemental flame. However, with the addition of the explosive rune, this ordinary rank 2 fire element spell became extremely terrifying in an instant. The surging pillars of fire sprayed onto the body of the ice dragon, but were blocked by the cold air lingering around the dragon's body. The flames could only spread around the dragon's smooth and graceful body. Ice and fire intertwined, and were detonated by the strange explosive rune. As a result, the surface of the ice dragon's body seemed to have been ignited with countless fireworks, and in an instant it exploded into a ball. The areas with dense cold air and thick scales were obviously not affected by the explosion of the flames. However, the ice dragon's body would always have some areas that were slightly weaker, and those areas were the most affected by the explosion of the flames. Chapter 606. From the moment the first trap was triggered to the ice dragon's awakening, only a short period of time had passed. But in this insignificant amount of time, Grimm and the others relied on Draconid Zatch's reckless charge to successfully pass through the 100-meter-long trap array. Then, they rushed to the side of the ice dragon and poured their first wave of attacks on it. Beep. Target's life force has been greatly reduced. Current status: 78%. 77%. A beep. Target has entered a temporary state of dizziness. Duration: 2:37 seconds. Beep. Target's armor has been reduced by 46%. Defensive elemental shield will disappear in 1:18 seconds. Beep. Target's right hind leg has suffered a crippling attack. Its hamstring has been severed. Estimated movement speed on land will be reduced by 56%. Beep. Target's left wing has suffered consecutive attack. Obvious damage has appeared. Estimated movement speed of target will be reduced by 21%. A series of prompts from the AI chip sounded in Grimm's mind, giving him a direct view of the battlefield's strength. Grimm, Mary, and Olina were like 3 annoying mosquitoes, circling Ice Dragon Alantini's huge body and dealing tons of damage every second. Grimm's fire attacks were focused on area of effect damage. Be it magma fireballs or exploding fireballs, they could instantly overturn half of the ice dragon's body. However, he did not cast any of the large-scale fire spells. The reason was that while these spells would damage the ice dragon, they would also interfere with the melee attacks of his 2 companions. Mary's attacks had also undergone a qualitative improvement after advancing to Grade 2. Against a terrifying ice dragon that stood at the top of the food chain, her attacks were no longer as insignificant as before. Relying on the combination of Blood Shadow Slash and Shadow Strike, Mary turned into a bloody shadow that circled around the ice dragon's body and continuously fired blood-red arrows. Each of her attacks triggered Blood Shadow Flurry and Shadow Strike at the same time, dealing multiple blood damage and shadow damage to the ice dragon. Both of these attacks ignored the user's defense. This meant that the ice dragon's solid ice armor and dense scales were as thin as paper in front of Mary, easily piercing through with a single stab. As for Olina, who had the title of Dragon Devourer, she was indeed a famous dragon slayer throughout the multiverse. Most of her racial abilities and close-range combat skills were specifically targeted at the dragon race bloodline. When fighting with the Dragon Clan, her strength, speed, agility, and explosive power would all increase exponentially. Although she didn't have an advantage in terms of size when facing a giant dragon of the same level, she possessed terrifying lethality that others couldn't compare to. As for the special abilities of the dragon race, it was very difficult for them to work on Ollie. Not to mention anything else, just the dragon's might, which he hated the most when slaying dragons, was ineffective against Ollie. When the ice dragon roared in anger after suffering a series of blows, all living beings within the ice palace would feel an indescribable suffocation and pressure. Those who were not mentally strong enough would give up attacking and defending as if they were struck by the art of fear when they were within the range of the terrifying dragon's coercion. They would throw away their weapons and run around the battlefield with their hands raised high in fear. Even an elemental wizard like Grimm, who was known for his strong mental strength, would feel dizzy from time to time during the battle after drinking the spirit protection potion. This could cause a large-scale spell that he had prepared for a long time to fail, or a sudden stutter in his originally smooth and natural movements. However, such a phenomenon had never been seen on Olina. Completely ignoring the dragon's might, Olina's petite body stuck to the surface of the ice dragon's body, dodging the flapping wings, the sharp claws, and the tearing of the giant dragon's mouth. She was like a piece of dogskin plaster that couldn't be torn off, firmly adhering to the ice dragon's body, constantly attacking the dragon's weak points with the bone-scraping knife and cruel claws in her hands. Dragon's eyes, nose, throat, lower abdomen, dragon's wings, moon-crafting door, back of the head, as long as it was a body part that the ice dragon couldn't attack, it was visited by this terrifying dragon slayer. What was left for Alantini was only the helplessness of having the strength to do anything, as well as the unforgettable pain. Ice Dragon Alantini had just woken up from a sweet sleep. Before he could understand what was going on, he was already half crippled by the four-man dragon-slaying team. The intense pain from his limbs and bones, the sullen feeling of being beaten up by an unknown enemy, and the terrifying feeling of death that came from the depths of his soul. All of this caused the fury in Ice Dragon Alantini's heart to explode like a fireball. Beep. Strong ice elemental energy has been detected in the target's body. Initial estimation is that it's a berserk dragon's breath, ice elemental. Energy intensity is around 300 to 500 degrees. Host is advised to retreat quickly. Safe distance is 200 meters, the AI chip's prompt shocked Grimm. 300 to 500 degrees? Even he would not be able to escape death if he was hit head-on. Retreat 200 meters away. Zacha, you take the lead. Grimm issued a series of orders in one breath with a look of shock on his face. Mary and Olina, who were happily sticking to the ice dragon's body and attacking it, were slightly startled when they heard this. Mary naturally did not doubt the accuracy of Grimm's orders. The moment she heard them, she immediately retreated. Olina hesitated for a moment. Perhaps in another 3 strikes, the ice dragon's left wing would be completely severed. If they retreated now, wouldn't all their previous efforts go to waste? However, since they were allies, the other party's reminder meant that they had discovered something. Besides, the female vampire's resolute retreat did not seem like she was trying to deceive them and allow them to snatch the credit for themselves. Hence, after a slight pause, Olina's black figure flashed as she followed closely behind Mary to escape. At this moment, Ice Dragon Alantini raised his neck and let out a deafening roar. He opened his mouth, and an earth-shattering ice dragon's breath was spat out from his thick throat. It was like a surging tide of ice that swept in all directions. For a moment, the large ice dragon's sleeping quarters were filled with a vast expanse of white, and the terrifying dragon's breath surged like waves. The temperature of this ice dragon's breath was extremely low, and it had the terrifying power to freeze all things. As the white, fog-like dragon's breath spread in all directions, everything in the ice dragon's sleeping quarters was sealed in a gigantic ice crystal. Even Ice Dragon itself, as well as Draconid Zacha, who had raised his 2 shields and was surrounded by an ice barrier, were sealed within the ice crystal. As Grimm and Mary had escaped in time, they were not frozen by the ice crystal. Olina, on the other hand, was a step too late, and the ice fog wrapped around her body. Fortunately, she had unleashed her strength in time. In addition, she was at the edge of the ice dragon's breath, which allowed her to shake off the ice fog and escape. Unfortunately, Zacha, who had been tasked with intercepting Ice Dragon, was frozen 5 steps away from the ice dragon. After escaping from the ice fog, Olina secretly glanced at the Tier 2 fire shaman, Grimm, and could not help but wonder how Grimm had discovered the ice dragon's strength before it had erupted. Back then, she was clearly closer to Ice Dragon, and they were closer to each other. Yet, in a situation where she was completely unaware, the fire shaman Grim had discovered the ice dragons gathering frost energy before she did. Could it be that Grim had the ability to predict the future? While Alina was bewildered, Grim strode forward and bombarded the gigantic ice crystal with rapid fire. It was easy to imagine that this was Ice Dragon's ultimate move to save his life and buy time. Once the terrifying Ice Dragon's breath was unleashed, the entire sleeping quarters would be frozen in the dense ice crystal along with his enemies. This way, he would be able to save his own life and buy time while waiting for the Draconid slave soldiers to arrive and disperse the enemy's firepower. Although Grim had overestimated Ice Dragon's breath, when the ice fog dissipated and everything within the ice crystal was revealed, Grim realized that he had still underestimated the Tier 2 Ice Dragon. Although the ice crystal, which was as hard as a diamond, had frozen Ice Dragon and Zacha, it did not affect Ice Dragon's movements and attacks in the slightest. While Draconid Zacha was frozen on the spot and could not move, Ice Dragon Alantini stretched its body freely and used the ice fog to treat the terrifying injuries on its body. Then, like a fish swimming in water, the ice dragon ignored the ice crystals as it advanced towards Draconid Zacha with steady and firm steps. Although Ice Dragon Alantini wanted to walk more elegantly and show its noble and calm demeanor, its severely injured right leg and left wing made it grimace in pain every time it moved. From the huge wound on his right leg, he could already see the broken bone sticking up high. It could only hop and hop as it walked, not daring to let its right leg touch the ground for fear that it would touch the terrifying wound again. Even if Ice Dragon Alantini had a beautiful appearance, it would not be able to show its elegance and grace when it walked in such a manner. The furious Alantini's pair of large dragon eyes had turned milky white, nurturing a terrifying wave of ice and blast. As it slowly approached Draconid Zacha, it opened its huge mouth and bit down on Zacha's head as slowly as possible. At this moment, Alantini was filled with hatred. It wanted to torture and kill this hateful enemy with the slowest speed possible, and use the death of the Draconid Zacha to stop the enemies that were blocked by the ice crystal. Only in this way could it relieve the resentment and rage in its chest. Even at this moment, it still did not know where these enemies came from, or why they invaded its bedroom and hurt its noble and elegant body. However, just as it was pretending to be elegant, the 2 bottles of ice-melting potion that Draconid Zacha had gulped down before the battle finally took effect. As the ice dragon's fangs approached, Draconid Zacha's originally immobile body suddenly changed. Chapter 607. Draconid Zacha thawed just in time. The 2 closed shields successfully blocked the ice dragon's ferocious fangs. All it had to pay was a mouthful of black blood. A dull thud resounded. The shields made of Kira's alloy and enchanted with frost resistance instantly caved in. The runes engraved on the shields exploded one after another, causing them to lose their basic resistance. Caught off guard, the ice dragon Alantini, who had used too much force, raised its neck in pain and let out a long hiss. A bloody dragon tooth flew out. However, at this moment, the Draconid warriors outside the ice palace roared furiously through the winding corridors and into the battlefield. A hint of hope suddenly surfaced in Ice Dragon Alantini's eyes. I can't let the ice dragon hide in the ice and do whatever it wants. Grim made up his mind and crushed 2 giant rubies in one go. Then, with the help of the Destructive Flames wizard staff, he finally cast a large-scale fire spell, Volcano of Doomsday. The eruption point of the magic volcano was right under the ice dragon's feet. Ice and fire would always counter each other. As a large amount of lava and terrifying flames gushed out from the volcano, the ice fog that filled the ice palace quickly dissipated. The giant ice crystal also began to melt and shrink at a speed visible to the naked eye. Seeing that its hiding place was about to be penetrated, Ice Dragon, who had recovered from a small portion of its injuries, once again launched a fierce attack at Draconid Zacha. Unfortunately, Zacha, who had given up on attacking, had become super tanky. With a full set of high-quality magic equipment and the countless elemental defenses around his body, he had basically armed himself into a steel golem. Amidst the continuous dull thuds, Ice Dragon Alantini's continuous attacks had ended in failure. At this moment, as a scorching heat wave blew over, the ice crystal finally shattered. The dragon-slaying operation was carried out smoothly. The 4 Crimson Family Tier 1 wizards could not withstand the continuous attacks of the Draconid warriors and could only retreat into the Ice Dragon's bedroom. Here, they formed a new line of defense, and the few Tier 2 sorcerers who had successfully captured the Ice Dragon took the opportunity to charge out and deal terrifying damage to the Draconians that were swarming in. At the same time, the 140 battle magical machines that came from the Metal Fortress also charged into the snowy peak, successfully outflanking the enemy. With a Tier 2 sorcerer blocking the way in front and a fearless metal magical weapon charging at them from the back, nearly 100 Draconians were caught in the middle, unable to advance or retreat. In the end, they too fell within the snow-covered Ice Dragon Palace. When the sky gradually darkened and the curtain of night shrouded the entire land, the battlefield that had been noisy for a day finally quieted down. Half of the 140 magic machines he brought were destroyed, and only 30 were left in good condition. The rest were either missing an arm or a leg. It seemed that they would not be able to recover their combat power until they were sent back to the maintenance workshop. And it was precisely those 30 magical machines that had now turned into construction machines, piling up the corpses of the Draconids and sending them to the Goblin airship to be transported back to the Metal Fortress. As for the heavily injured Draconians who were still breathing, they drank healing potions and locked them up in the Draconid camp. Late at night, a newly constructed floating ship appeared on the lonely snowy peak and slowly landed in front of the Ice Dragon Palace. When the wide metal gangplank was set up, batches of construction machines walked out with heavy footsteps. The huge floating ships in the Goblin Plane could not be delivered to the Lance Plane through teleportation devices, so the Metal Fortress gathered a large number of Goblin engineers and technicians. It took an entire month for them to finally build another floating ship with simple engineering facilities. Previously, when the Fire Dragoness was wreaking havoc near the Metal Fortress, Gazruvi did not dare to release the new floating ship. This kind of floating ship, which lacked powerful defensive means, was invincible when it bullied the monsters on the ground that could not fly. But once it encountered a huge creature like the Fire Dragoness, it could only passively take a beating. So after a few days, when the Fire Dragoness ran into the depths of the Stoneclaw Mountains to hunt for food, Gazruvi took the opportunity to release her. The Metal Fortress was a full 700 kilometers away from the lonely snowy peak. With such a long distance, it would probably take 8 to 10 days to transport the heavily injured and captured Ice Dragon back by land. With such a long time and such a long journey, any accident could make all of Grimm's efforts go down the drain. Therefore, Grimm had no choice but to deploy a floating ship to transport the Ice Dragon and the wealth of the entire dragon lair by air. It had to be said that every dragon had great potential. Although this Grade 2 Ice Dragon was still a young dragon and did not participate too much in the plundering activities of the other dragons, the gold, gems, and all kinds of rare items that she had gathered from her lair still filled up the huge palace. Grimm looked at it briefly and shook his head regretfully. Robbing a young azure dragon was not as good as robbing an old one. Although the Ice Dragon seemed to have a lot of wealth, most of it was gold, antiques, agates, crowns, and other common items that she had plundered from the human kingdoms. If they were to be brought to a human kingdom, they might cause quite a stir. However, in the eyes of a sorcerer, they were just some useless objects. To Magi, thousands of gold coins were not as useful as a magic gem. The former could only be used as ornaments, while the latter could be used as a supplementary material for casting spells, making the spells more powerful and faster. Flashy but impractical. This was Grimm's evaluation of the ice dragon's treasure after seeing it. However, even a broken boat had 3 pounds of nails. After sorting out the ice dragon's treasure, Grimm still found something that could be of use. A magic gem. A magic gem that could store a complete spell. During a battle, a magus would need to chant an incantation in order to cast a spell. Together with hand gestures and a staff, as well as some supplementary materials, it would be possible to activate a powerful and terrifying spell. Now that he had a magic gem, he could store a complete spell inside it, and when he needed to use it, he only needed to chant a short incantation to quickly activate it. This was undoubtedly a great help to a magus in battle. Unfortunately, after inspecting the quality of the magic gem, Grimm regretfully found that it could only store a rank 1 spell at most, which was useless to him. However, it was quite useful to a rank 1 magus. Hence, after some hesitation, Grimm gave it to Bliss, the insect witch who had put in the most effort in today's battle. Apart from the magic gem, the engineering androids also found a high-quality frost hammer from the pile of gems. It was a one-handed hammer with a strange design. One side of the hammerhead was flat, while the other side was sharp. The body of the hammer was covered in sparkling frost and icicles. When the user wielded the warhammer, a strange frost power would spread out from the warhammer, dealing 70 degrees of frost damage to nearby enemies and reducing their movement speed by 40%. Such a powerful weapon would naturally not be given to others. Of course, it would be given to the person who had contributed the most in this battle, Dragonoid Zacha. To be honest, the head of the frost hammer was the size of 2 human heads, and it weighed 200 to 300 kilograms. In the Crimson family, only Dragonoid Zacha could wield such a heavy weapon. Looking at the powerful magic weapon in front of him, Zacha fell silent. After hesitating for a long time, he finally bent down and picked up the hammer. As soon as the war hammer was in his hand, a milky white halo of ice appeared beside him. It was like a beautiful belt of light, condensing the moisture in the air into ice shards. The ice shards covered Draconid Zacha's body and armor. "Thank you, Master," Dragonman Zacha said to Grimm after playing with Dance like the wind for a while. Although he had been serving Grimm for half a year and had always done his best to complete the missions that Grimm had given him, this was the first time he had expressed his gratitude from the bottom of his heart. Hence, it was difficult to say it out loud. However, after saying this, his usually serious expression relaxed a little. Grimm did not say anything else, only smiling and nodding in response. At this warm moment, an inopportune voice suddenly interrupted them. All right, stop dawdling. Isn't it time to think about how to divide the ice dragon?" Among the people present, there was only one person who could ruin the atmosphere like this. It was the impatient and thirsty dragon devourer, Ollie. She circled around the ice dragon that had a huge bump on its head and was panting heavily on the ground. She looked like she could not wait to pounce on it and devour it. Meanwhile, Ice Dragon, whose limbs had been dislocated and was immobilized by countless restraining runes, widened his dragon eyes, glaring at the enemy of the dragon race with eyes filled with hatred and rage. "Yes, we've finally won the battle. It's time to divide the spoils of war." Grimm turned his head and smiled, his clear gaze landing on Ollie. "In this battle, Her Excellency Ollie has gravely injured the ice dragon's body and restricted its mobility. You deserve great credit." Hearing Grimsley's praise, Olivia's face, which was covered by a black scarf, revealed a proud smile. But then, Grimm's tone changed. "In view of Her Excellency Ollie's outstanding contributions, you naturally have the right to choose the ice dragon." Ollie's eyes instantly lit up. "Then, Her Excellency Ollie, please choose first. Do you want the left half of the ice dragon or the right half? Or the front half or the back half?" "Half." Ollie was instantly dumbfounded. She used her hand to trace the ice dragon's massive body, unable to understand what was going on. "Her Excellency Ollie, although your contributions are great, It's not to the point where you can take the entire dragon for yourself. There were 4 Grade 2 combatants participating in the battle, and your contribution is only 1/4 of the total. But seeing that you've fought hard, I can make the decision to give you the right to choose first. Tell me, how are you going to cut the ice dragon into 4 pieces, and you can choose the first? Grimm smiled faintly. Chapter 608. A quarter of a dragon? If a dragon devourer wanted to improve itself, it had to devour an entire dragon in order to obtain its bloodline, constitution, magic resistance, and soul. If it was chopped into 4 pieces, would it still be a dragon? At this moment, Ollie was extremely depressed and aggrieved. But thinking about it, she could not find any fault with Grimm's words. The 4 of them had worked together to kill an ice dragon, and under the circumstances where their combat strength was almost the same, it was inevitable that she would only get a quarter. But this was too far from what she had hoped for all this time. Don't tell me you intend to give me a leg or wing every time you slay a dragon? Olivia angrily squeezed out a question through gritted teeth. 2 dangerous flames lit up in the depths of her green eyes. Of course not. Grimm was still smiling. As far as I know, only a dragon with a complete body and soul can strengthen you. How could I do such a thing that spoils the fun? Then what do you want to do? There are only 2 choices. 1, I'll pay you according to your contributions after every battle, but you'll only get a quarter of the dragon. Just tell me the second one. 2, you can give up on this choice and accumulate your contributions. Then the next time you slay a dragon, you'll get half of a dragon. Ollie's expression crumbled once more. So you're saying that if I want to get a dragon, I have to help you capture 4 dragons? That's the basic situation. After all, we're only allies, a temporary union of interest. I can't give you a portion of the reward in advance just to please you. So, that's why I became your free labor and cheap fighter, available at your beck and call. And all of this is for the sake of the dragon you might get in the future. The more Olina spoke, the angrier she became. Her green eyes were filled with unconcealable rage. Grimm spread his hands helplessly. If you had the strength to kill a Grade 2 dragon by yourself, you wouldn't have to be held hostage by me. It's a pity that wind dragons run fast, fire dragons stay far away, ice dragons are too hard to deal with, water dragons are hard to find, and lightning dragons can teleport. If you want to catch them, you'll have to put in a lot of effort. Hearing Grimm list the terrifying aspects of pure-blooded dragons, Ollie's anger subsided, and her eyes were filled with helplessness. She had the title of Dragon Devourer, and had the upper hand when fighting dragons of the same rank. However, winning did not mean that she could catch them. While dragons were of different species and had different battle styles, they all had one thing in common, and that was that they could fly. This did not sound like much, but when it came to dragons, it was incomprehensible. It possessed impressive strength and a powerful physique. In melee combat, it had sharp fangs, massive wings, and a long tail. In ranged combat, it had draconic magic and dragon breath. This was already powerful and difficult to deal with. Furthermore, all of them could fly, which gave them the right to fight. If they could win, they would dive down and fight fiercely, but if they couldn't, they would just fly away and escape. Which ordinary magical creature could fight against such a troublemaker? Although Ollie was known as the Dragon Slayer, and had the skills to slay dragons, if the dragons turned and ran the moment they saw her, it would be difficult for her to catch them even with her strength. This was also the main reason why she took the initiative to look for Grimm. Not only did Grimm have great strength, he also had the manpower to carry out his plan. Only a person like him could carry out a suitable plan to trap a dragon lord in a hopeless situation that he could not escape from. Therefore, Olivia was just the icing on the cake for Grimm when it came to slaying the dragon. She was just another layer of insurance for Grimm. Grimm, on the other hand, was indispensable to Ollie, and was very important. The positions of both sides were not equal from the very beginning. When she thought about how she would have to help Grim kill 3 more Grade 2 dragons in order to obtain a complete dragon, Ollie found it hard to calm down. But how could someone who could wander alone in another world be a pushover? Ollie rolled her eyes and immediately put on a smile. Sir Grim, can you bear to see a lady fall into such pain? Ollie, who had changed her strategy, immediately turned into a sorrowful and dejected lady. She walked gracefully toward Grim with her cat-like steps, cupping her hands in front of her chest, looking extremely heartbroken. To be honest, when a beautiful woman with a voluptuous figure poses like this in front of you, there were not many people who could resist her seductive charm and seductive figure. However, if it concerned a dragon that was worth millions of gold coins, then even the heavenly king would not be able to negotiate. Grim immediately revealed a lecherous look, extending his hand to wrap around Ollie's slender waist. He leaned over and whispered in her ear, "If Madame Ollie is willing to visit my wizard's pagoda tonight, I can give you my share as well. How about it? That's half of a dragon." Mary's cold snort came from not far away. The moment Grim's hand touched her, Ollie could not help but shiver. If not for the Oath of Alliance, she would have used her sharp claws to dig a few holes in this detestable wizard's body. She was the one who had chosen to use her magic first, but when Grim approached her with a lecherous look, Ollie was suddenly terrified. With a twist of her waist, the assassin Ollie easily broke free from Grim's large hand and walked away without looking back. "I'll keep the dragon's portion for now. But if you dare to miss even a single gold coin from my portion of the dragon's treasure, I won't let you off." Once she finished speaking, Olivia's body twisted a few times before she vanished. In the next second, the tender flesh on Grim's waist was pinched by a pair of small hands that were as fair as snow. 3 circles to the left, 3 circles to the right. She did not use much strength, but the pain was unforgettable to Grim. "You're not allowed to hook up with that guy," Mary said fiercely and walked away without looking back, just like Olina. As she walked, her slender waist swayed like a willow in the wind. With every step she took, she swayed gracefully, causing Grim's heart to burn with desire. He couldn't help but lick his lip. These days, he had been busy with the Crimson family and the development of Lance, and it had been a long time since he had a deep conversation with Mary. Recently, he had unlocked a few more exquisite moves, and it seemed like he could consider indulging himself a little. Unfortunately, before Grim could put his plan into action, a goblin engineer waved his hands and ran over from the floating ship, holding a small piece of paper in his hand. "Guests have come to visit, return quickly." This was a short message sent by Gaz Ruvi through the communication device on the floating ship. There was no head or tail, and it seemed like he was deliberately mystifying things. It should not be an enemy, or else with Gaz Ruvi's cowardly personality, he would have asked him to return long ago. Guess? Grim was a little stunned. He did not seem to have any old acquaintances in Lance. It couldn't be some wandering magus from the Magus world coming to visit him, could it? No, wait a minute. It seemed, maybe, probably, he really did have an old friend in Lance. Something flashed in Grim's mind, and he could vaguely guess who the visitor was. All right, it was time to have a serious talk with it. After hastily cleaning up the entire lonely snow mountain, Grim brought all his subordinates and boarded the floating ship. They slowly rose into the sky and began their journey back. This lonely snow mountain was chosen by the ice dragon Alantini to be its lair, so there had to be something mysterious about it. It would be a waste to abandon it just like that. However, if the Crimson family wanted to expand their influence in Lance, they had to clench their fists tightly. They could not just open their arms and wait for their enemies to break them one by one. That was why all the Magi had retreated to the metal fortress after the battle to avoid a regrettable scene. However, such a good base could not be abandoned so easily. Thus, Grim left a goblin engineer and 2 goblin technicians in the palace, as well as 5 construction machines and 10 combat magic machines. The mission Grimm gave them was to use the lonely snow mountain as a temporary camp and thoroughly investigate all the living creatures, minerals, and plants in Ice Dragon territory. They were not allowed to have conflicts with the large native tribes unless necessary, and they had to do their best to understand the distribution of resources in Ice Dragon territory. Every 3 days, the temporary leader of the Goblin Engineer had to contact the Metal Fortress via long-distance communication to report on the information they had gathered over the past 3 days. The Metal Fortress would also send the Goblin airship to deliver the necessary facilities, supplies, and reinforcements at the appropriate time. Once everything was arranged, the floating ship flew high into the clouds, using the cover of the night and clouds to fly towards the Stoneclaw Mountains at high speed. Due to the lack of special alloys, the floating ship's engine room still used the old spatial furnace instead of the latest magic furnace. In order to build a super magic furnace that could support the entire metal fortress, Grimm had already used up a third of the Kalos alloy excavated from the ruins of the Steel City. The remaining Kalos alloy could only build 3 to 5 miniaturized magic furnaces at most. However, the miniaturized magic furnace blueprint was still in the process of calculation and optimization, so it was difficult to satisfy the explosive growth of the magic machine army in the near future. Ordinary magic machines could use the enhanced magic batteries. Only the elite magic machine warriors needed to use the miniaturized magic furnace. In the previous battle in the Swamp of Sorrow, the Goblin Ripper and the Goblin Fireman were the 2 most eye-catching types of magic machine warriors. They were currently being strengthened and optimized. Chapter 609. Grimm's old friend, Arms the Thunder Dragon, was waiting at the entrance of the Metal Fortress. It was apparent that Arms had concealed his identity on this trip. Not only did he transform into his human form, but he had also donned a thick robe that completely concealed his figure and appearance. Arms stood alone in front of the towering walls of the metal fortress. He silently looked up at the huge metal object that was more than 100 meters long appearing in the distant sky and quickly arriving above his head. The giant airship hovered above the half-mountain, half-metal castle for a moment. Then, with the sound of grinding gears, an entrance suddenly opened up above the metal castle that had been in perfect harmony with the mountain just a moment ago. Under Arms' astonished gaze, the airship slowly sank into the opening. From afar, it looked as though the metal monster in the belly of the mountain had swallowed the airship in one gulp. It was a shocking sight to behold. Since the metal fortress had surpassed the steam power stage, all the energy consumed within it came from the magical furnace. Therefore, there were no huge boilers, steam engines, or huge clouds of water vapor. Half of the mountain in front of him had been hollowed out by the metal monster, turning it into a half-mountain, half-metal fortress. The half-mountain that Arms was facing had been completely turned into a metal wall. The thickness of the wall was shocking. More importantly, the metal wall was as clean as new, and there were no entrances or exits. Arms couldn't break in even if he wanted to. It seemed like he had no other way but to smash the wall. While Arms was deep in thought, a loud and long dragon roar suddenly came from the depths of the Stoneclaw Mountains. Upon hearing the dragon's roar, Arms, who had remained calm a moment ago, began to panic. "Welcome to my territory, Lord Arms. Please." Grimm was already standing respectfully in front of the metal wall. The metal door behind him slid to the side, revealing a huge entrance that was 5 meters tall and 10 meters wide. On both sides of the door were 2 rows of tall and mighty metal puppets. There were roughly 30 of them. Arms looked back. With his excellent eyesight as a dragon, he could clearly see a small black dot that suddenly appeared at the end of the horizon. Although it was still 20 to 30 miles away, Arms could already vaguely sense the surging presence of the fire element. It was a fire dragon, according to its memories. There was only one fire dragon that lived near the Stoneclaw Mountains and the Swamp of Sorrows. That was the powerful fire dragon lady, Pheliba, who occupied the Doomsday Castle. Damn it, that was a powerful Tier 3 fire dragon. Moreover, it was tyrannical and extremely belligerent. Who would have thought that these human sorcerers would provoke such a terrifying fellow as soon as they arrived here? Damn it, damn it, damn it, Arms cursed inwardly. For a moment, no one knew if it was cursing the female dragon or Grim. Arms didn't bother being polite to Grim and strode into the strange fortress made entirely of metal. From the looks of it, it didn't seem to want to meet the fire dragon girl in the distance. As soon as he entered, Arms was stunned by what he saw. How was this a castle? This was simply a terrifying metal city that occupied a vast area and had perfect functions. The silver-white metal floor stretched out in front of Arms' eyes. On both sides of the road were metal warehouses and metal buildings that rose from the ground. The crisscrossing metal paths could lead to any corner of the metal city, and the ones walking on them were terrifying metal magical machines with heavy footsteps and dense auras. There were as many as 20 security magic machines at the transportation hubs. Judging from their appearance and shape, they seemed to be divided into different types of magic machines. Some of the magic machines looked like 8-clawed spiders. Their disc-shaped metal bodies were densely packed with strange compound eyes that looked like beehives. They stood on both sides of the road and scanned every magic machine that passed by. Their compound eyes flashed with strange spectral rays. It seemed like there was more than one way to detect something. Apart from the fixed sentries, there were also metal eyeballs the size of a human head hovering above the metal city. They didn't have wings, but they could fly freely in the sky by relying on a few jets that emitted a faint blue light. From time to time, they would suddenly hover above a building or a magical machine, projecting a wide and illusory green belt of light from their mechanical bellies. The metal that was swept by the bands of light would instantly turn transparent, revealing the contents and structure of the metal to the eyeballs. Although the city was huge and bustling with activity, and filled with gigantic metal magical machines, there was strangely not much noise or ear-piercing noises. The construction machines walking on it were either carrying huge metal boxes or large piles of metal ingots or some kind of rare materials. Arms looked around and couldn't find a single one among the hundreds of magic machines and construction machines. They seemed to be busy all the time, never knowing fatigue. Arms could also sense a powerful spiritual power emanating from them. Indeed, ever since he stepped into the metal city, Arms could clearly sense that every piece of metal and metal here was permeated with an indescribable mental force. It was as if they were being controlled and ruled by a powerful mind and will. It was that strange, grade 3 brain monster. There was no need for further explanation. Arms, who had participated in the entire battle at the Goblin Plain, immediately thought of that strange lifeform. That guy's physical combat ability was almost zero, but in terms of magical energy and mental ability control, he was clearly far stronger than he was. Who would have thought that it had also survived that big explosion? Just as Arms was regretting that he didn't get rid of the root of the problem the last time, a loud rumble came from the thick metal wall behind him, followed by a piercing siren. It seemed that the irascible fire dragon lady was here to attack the city. As soon as the siren sounded, the originally peaceful metal city suddenly changed. The engineering robots that were moving along the metal path in an orderly manner moved to the sides of the path. Meanwhile, a few huge warehouses and fortresses near the metal walls opened up abruptly, and groups of battle magical machines and gigantic and exaggerated goblin war chariots ran out from within. The combat machines and chariots quickly gathered near the metal walls and formed battle formations, quietly waiting for news. The metal walls were receiving more and more frequent attacks. Asterisk thud thud thud. Asterisk dull sounds echoed above the metal city. Rocks and rocks began to fall from the sky, but they didn't cause too much damage to the metal city. Inside the metal walls, about 100 meters above the ground, there were strange metal buildings. When the metal walls were attacked, countless small cannons silently opened up on the metal walls. The metal buildings moved forward and extended their pitch-black cannons. When the metal wall was attacked, countless small cannons silently opened up on the metal wall. The metal building moved forward and the black cannons extended out. Immediately after, a massive amount of magical energy was transmitted from the underground of the metal city. The magical energy flowed along the walls of the metal structure and quickly extended toward the strange metal building. As the magical energy gathered grew larger and larger, the magic energy cannons trembled soundlessly and shot out frighteningly powerful energy beams. Arms didn't know the situation outside. However, as the magic cannons continued to fire, the attacks on the metal walls stopped abruptly. It seemed that the enemies outside had no time to attack the metal walls and were busy defending against the terrifying energy attacks. The short battle only lasted for a quarter of an hour before it ended. A few moments later, dozens of metal gates of various sizes opened. Squads of combat machines and construction machines swarmed out and launched their final assault on the remaining enemies in the distance. Soon, teams of construction machines lifted, carried draconids with broken limbs and mangled flesh back to the city, before locking them in special cells and prisons one after another. Even though Arms didn't care about the strength of the magic machines, he watched everything with a pale face. This was Lance Plain, the backyard of the low and mid-tier dragon overlords. However, when Arms saw the scene before him, his heart trembled and he was terrified. Once upon a time, the dragons were the masters behind the scenes, and the Draconians were the undisputed rulers of this place. But now, just like how the Draconians slaughtered the native tribes, the Metal City was also slaughtering the Draconians with a clear plan and a clear target. The hunters in the past had become the prey of someone else. Arms found it hard to adapt to such a reversal of the situation. Just as Arms was silently mourning for the Draconians outside, a short, mournful dragon roar sounded from within the Metal City. Arms turned around and saw a large group of metal puppets working together on a tall metal platform to move a white dragon covered in translucent white scales down from the floating warship. It was the dragon that had suddenly woken up and let out a short roar. Ice Dragon Alantini. Arms didn't even need to take a closer look. He could tell who it was just by looking at its sparkling and beautiful ice scales. In the Lance realm, this Grade 2 Ice Dragon Alantini was a rare beauty. Unfortunately, looking at the situation, she seemed to have fallen into the hands of the group of sorcerers. Chapter 610. What? Lord Arms, do you recognize this ice dragon? Grim asked curiously as he led Arms around the metallic city. Arms hesitated for a moment before nodding with difficulty. By the way, Lord Arms, how did you know we were here? Arms' human form was that of a tall man in exquisite blue armor. He had a handsome face and a tall posture, and every movement he made had an indescribable aura about him. Hearing Grim's question, Arms rolled his eyes, showing an expression that said, "You still dare to ask me? Humph, that's a good question. Since I've already given Zachary to you, you should know the location of my territory, right? Travel 70,000 kilometers northeast from the Stoneclaw Mountains. After passing through the territories of the 12 Dragon Lords, you should be able to reach Lord Arms' Thunder Cliff." Grim answered without hesitation, as if he had done some research on this. Arms' expression froze. "I thought that erasing the waymark in Zachary's mind would be enough to stop you. Unfortunately, a month ago, I suddenly sensed that a waymark I'd set had been touched, and I knew that something was wrong. In the end, you still managed to obtain the coordinates of Lance from the goblins." At this point, Arms' face was full of vexation. The invasion of the goblins was the first time he'd organized an independent operation after becoming a rank 3 Dragon Lord, and yet he'd already made such a huge mistake. He couldn't help but feel vexed. Strictly speaking, it was the grave mistake it had made that led to the invasion of Lance by this group of wizards. If he hadn't acted so recklessly, Lance and the young dragons wouldn't have met with such misfortune. They would still be able to leisurely enjoy the life of a lord. Hearing Arms' explanation, Grim relaxed a little. The waymark they'd used had been set by Arms himself, so it was completely normal for him to have done something to it. Truth be told, Grim was glad that this was the case. If Arms had found out about Grim and the others through other means, wouldn't that mean that the Magi's movements had already been exposed to the high-ranked dragons? Since Arms had found him through the waymark, this meant that the Crimson family's invasion hadn't been discovered by the high-ranked dragons yet. This was actually very easy to understand. The Dragon Clan had always been a race with a long lifespan. Their attitude towards time was completely different from that of humans. It had only been a month since the Crimson family invaded the Lance Plain. This amount of time wasn't even enough for most dragon lords to take a nap. The news of the Metal Castle's existence only spread slowly among the few dragon territories near the Stoneclaw Mountains and the Swamp of Sorrows. As for the dragon territory, which was slightly further away, they knew nothing about their existence, nor were they interested in knowing. Just like this time, he had traversed a distance of 700 kilometers to ambush the ice dragon Alantini. The other party did not seem to be prepared at all. At the very least, they were defenseless against outsiders like them. That was why Grim and the others were able to capture him alive in a mere 15 minutes, even though he was caught off guard by Grim and the others. If that ice dragon knew the inside story, it wouldn't have been defeated so easily and miserably. But now, she had been reduced from a high and mighty giant dragon lord to a person standing on a platform, with all kinds of magi pointing fingers at her and appraising her according to weight. After all, Grim and Arms had signed an agreement to help each other in battle. In fact, they could even be considered allies. However, now that the flames of war had spread to Arms' homeland, the relationship between them had become extremely awkward. Lord Arms, since we're already here, we won't leave so easily. In order to reconcile our relationship, I feel that I need to understand your attitude. Grim asked bluntly, how do you plan to deal with the matter of us entering the Lance Plain? Grim's question was very direct. He was basically forcing Arms to express his stance on whether he was a friend or foe. After all, this Thunder Dragon knew the true identity of Grim and the others, as well as the strength of his family. If he chose to become an enemy of the Crimson family, Grim and the others would have to pay a huge price to take him down. Grim wasn't that stupid. After all, he had only brought Arms to the top of the metal fortress. The core of the fortress was actually hidden hundreds of meters below the surface of the mine. As for the Tier 3 brain monster, Gaz Ruvi, with the support of the enhanced magic furnace, as well as the fact that this was its territory, it wouldn't be any weaker than the Thunder Dragon, Arms, even in its territory. Furthermore, Grim still had Olivia the Dragon Eater in his hands. If he were to throw her out at a critical moment, he would be able to intimidate the arrogant Thunder Dragon Overlord, even if he couldn't catch her easily. Hence, even though Grim was only a Tier 2 wizard, he could still calmly face off against Arms, a Tier 3 Dragon Lord, despite having a trump card in his hand. Vexed, extremely vexed, if Arms could use half of his wealth to get the Magi out of Lance, he would definitely agree to it without hesitation. It was a pity that after tasting the sweetness in Lance, it was almost impossible to dissuade them with such minuscule benefits. After thinking about it for a while, Arms didn't know what to do. If it was Arms in the past, he would have used force if he couldn't persuade Arms. However, after the battle in the Goblin's Plain, he had experienced the viciousness, and cunning of the Magi in front of him. If he were to resort to force, Arms looked around the thick and solid guest hall that was comparable to a metal cage, and sensed the powerful spiritual force that lingered around him. Finally, Arms gave up on using force to solve this problem. Since he couldn't drive the Magi out of Lance, he could only settle for the next best thing, which was to ensure that the interests of the Thunder Dragon clan wouldn't be affected. Thus, in the following period of time, the two of them had an open discussion. Half a day later, after obtaining a satisfactory result, Lightning Dragon Arms stealthily left the metal fortress. Magus World, Tower of Destiny. As the dazzling starlight on the astrological platform began to dissipate, Alice's tall and graceful figure slowly appeared. When she walked out of the spell formation with a solemn expression, the little elf Helen, who had been quietly guarding by her side, flew over while scattering fireflies all the way. How was it? How was it? Is there any result this time? Little Helen floated to Alice's shoulder and whispered into her ear. So what if I did? So what if I didn't? Alice said with a disappointed expression. There has to be a result. Little Helen said anxiously as she flew in front of Alice. You've already exhausted so much of your life force. If there's no result, Little Helen suddenly stopped talking. From her angle, she could clearly see that the silky silver hair of her master, who was less than 100 years old, had turned snow white. Alice's face was pale, and her body was weak. It was as if a gust of wind could easily blow her away. Alice thought for a moment and shook her head with a bitter smile. I'm sorry, but it seems like there's no result this time. Little Helen flew up to Alice, with her hands on her hips, and her cheeks puffed out as she glared at her. Do you think we magic fairies are fools that can be fooled? I can clearly see that after your divination, the spell formation has resonated with the power of the stars, and some obvious abnormalities have appeared. This is a typical sign of a successful divination. How long do you plan to hide it from me? Alice stood up and sighed. So what if it's successful? So what if it's not successful? Fate showed you an impossible path. Doesn't that mean there's no path at all? What exactly did fate tell you? Weren't you asking about the direction to advance to grade 2? Why would fate show you a dead end? Little Helen asked curiously. Alice looked at the starlight on the astrological platform that had yet to completely dissipate. She said calmly, I've divined 3 times in a row. Fate has told me that my only chance to advance to the second order will be in the planar expedition in 3 months. That's an extremely powerful medium-sized plane. Do you think our Tower of Destiny can participate in a planar expedition of that level with our strength? Little Helen was stunned when she heard this. She didn't expect that Alice's opportunity to advance would fall on a foreign plane, and a plane with a powerful indigenous civilization at that. Such a plane had terrifying foreign gods at every turn, and it was impossible for people to enter and leave as they pleased like those small planes. Devouring such a foreign plane would naturally allow any wizard's power to expand rapidly. But in contrast, the difficulty of invading would instantly increase by tens of times, or even hundreds of times. It could be said that if the invading wizard's power was slightly weaker, it was very likely that they would be completely annihilated in these terrifying foreign planes. At that time, not to mention the benefits of the plane, even their lives would be difficult to preserve. Previously, Alice had contributed the world waymark of a large plane to the Northern Witch Leaders' meeting. According to tradition, if other Northern Witch factions wanted to participate, they would also have to contribute the high-quality planes in their hands. So after hesitating again and again, the leaders of the various witch factions could only announce the medium-sized planes in their hands one after another. Although they couldn't be as powerful as the large plane Alice had contributed, they also had countless animals, plants, monsters, and all kinds of resources. And Alice's 3 consecutive divinations pointed to a medium-sized plane shared by the Pale Witches, the Fane Plane. According to the rules, the Pale Witches would open a portal to the Fane Plane in 3 months. At that time, all Northern Witch factions could send troops to participate in the plundering of the Fane Plane, and all the gains would belong to their own faction. It sounded very beautiful and a very fair operation, but for the Fate Witches who had few troops, such an opportunity was equivalent to not having it. With the current strength of the Fate Witches, entering a medium-sized plane to plunder was simply asking for death. Chapter 6:11. Isn't there still that grim? Just as Alice was lost and hesitating, little Helen's eyes suddenly lit up and she flew up and down excitedly. The last time we went to the Flame Monarch, I saw that his strength seemed to be developing quite well. Perhaps, Alice thought for a moment and then shook her head, they've just discovered a small plane that's not bad. The power inside is quite troublesome, and not any weaker than the Fane plane of the Ashen Witches. At this time, it'll be difficult for them to take out enough people. Besides, this is an internal matter of the Northern Witches. He's an outsider. Humph, what outsider? Little Helen curled her lips in disdain. The last time he called you over to help him set up the platform, he treated you as if you were his subordinate. Now that you're in trouble, if he dares not help, I'll definitely scold him to death. Alice's elegant brows furrowed, and she reprimanded with dissatisfaction. Helen, I won't allow you to meddle. I was only able to become a Destiny Witch because of his help, so it's necessary for me to help him do some things. This trip to the Fane Plane will be very dangerous, and I don't want his family, which has just begun to take shape, to disappear into thin air. So, she had just completed a large-scale divination, and her mental and physical strength had been greatly depleted. Now that she was forcefully arguing with little Helen, Alice felt dizzy and nauseous halfway through her words. Her vision darkened and she fell to the ground. This scared little Helen half to death. She waved her little magic wand and cast a levitation spell on Alice, and then used the power of wind to carry her out of the astrological platform. Grimm heard the news a little later. Hence, he first teleported from the Lance Plane to the Goblin Plane, then from the Goblin Plane to the Flame Monarch, and finally arrived at the Tower of Destiny after much difficulty. Even with his strength as a Rank 2 Magus, he felt a little dizzy by the time he arrived at the Tower of Destiny, and his body was unsteady. He hurried to Alice's residence, and saw the unconscious Alice lying on her sickbed. The 7 witches of the Destiny Witch faction, including Sophia the Berserk and Chave the Ice Maiden, were all gathered here, their expressions solemn. Seeing Grimm's arrival, their faces were filled with displeasure. Grimm leaned forward to check on her. Through the AI chip scan, he found that her vitality was severely depleted. Her spiritual force was extremely weak, and the spectrum that represented her vitality was extremely dim. He could not help but ask in surprise, what happened to Alice? What else could it be? Of course, it's because I've performed too many divination rituals, and the loss of life energy is too severe. That's why. Helen, who was the size of a palm, put her hands on her hips and looked angry. However, before she could finish speaking, Chef grabbed her and tapped her forehead with her finger. She then said to Grimm coldly, "Since you have seen the Tower Master, please leave now." Grimm was silent for a moment, then he looked around at the witches in the room. "Although I'm not a member of the Tower of Destiny, I have an inseparable bond with Alice. So, I hope you won't hide anything from me." Chef was slightly startled, and was momentarily speechless. On the other hand, little Helen teleported away from Chef's control and appeared in front of Grimm again. She floated close to him and stared at him, asking, "Is what you said true? If Alice is in trouble, are you willing to save her?" "Of course," Grimm said resolutely. "Alice's matters are my matters. I will definitely take care of her matters." "That's good." Little Helen's face lit up with joy. Just as she was about to tell him everything, she was interrupted by a cold voice. "Helen, you're too impudent." Alice had woken up at some point, and she forced herself to sit up. She angrily rebuked, "This is a matter between us witches. Why did you call him here?" Grimm looked around at the group, and vaguely understood something. He simply sat on the edge of the bed and grabbed Alice's fair and slightly thin right hand. "Alice, don't you know how I feel about you? If you doubt the authenticity of my feelings, you can use that divination spell of yours to test." Before he finished speaking, 7 bright rays of divination light fell on him at the same time. 70% real, 30% fake. Fake doesn't seem like a lie. Humph, it really isn't 100% real. Men are all like this. Forget it, forget it. This is still better than the others. For the time being, I'll believe him this time. He's lucky this time, he passed. These guys, Grimm's body stiffened, and his forehead was immediately filled with black lines. This Alice in front of him seemed to have a knot in her heart, but with so many ducks surrounding him, even if he wanted to confess, it would be difficult for him to do so. While Grimm was in a dilemma, Alice, who was blushing, began to chase them away shyly. Somehow, after the divination spell, when the witches in the room looked at Grimm again, they no longer had the previous estrangement and strangeness. They all laughed and left the room. When only Grimm, Alice, and the sneaky little Helen were left in the room, Grimm pulled Alice into his arms and leaned his face against her soft, silky white hair, inhaling the faint fragrance of her body. Although Alice's figure was tall and graceful, her body was obviously too thin and weak. Grimm could clearly feel that she was not plump enough, and when his big hands turned over, he could even feel that it was a little uncomfortable. At this moment, Alice was like a shy little sheep, lightly pressing her head against Grimm's shoulder. Her body was slightly trembling, and it was difficult for her to organize her words. Grimm laughed and pulled Alice into his arms, letting her cry out softly. Only then did he raise his head to look at little Helen with a smile. "All right, I've settled your mistress. Now, you can tell me everything from beginning to end." "Oh my! Bad man, stinky man. You really want to do bad things wherever you go." Little Helen covered her eyes with her hands and flew around the two like a headless fly. When she saw that Grimm did not make any further moves, she carefully whispered into his ear and told him everything about Alice's advancement and the Fairn Plain. "You can already advance?" Grimm was happy at first, but then he could not help but complain. "Alice, what's wrong with you this time? That's not like you at all. There's no point in hiding anything. You should have told us earlier, and then we could have discussed it together. We would have come up with a solution." Alice separated her two small hands and desperately grabbed Grimm's big hands, who wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to do bad things. She said shyly, "I'm not worried that you've just brought people into the Lance Plain, and we haven't figured out anything yet. If you rashly withdraw your troops, it will easily cause all your previous efforts to go to waste. Besides, this operation is an internal matter of the Northern Witches, and outsiders are not allowed to take part." Grimm smiled. "I'm not an outsider. I'm your lover. No one can object if I use this name to participate, right?" Although the Northern Witches' territory was dominated by witches, there were still wizards in every faction. However, these wizards had an awkward position in the Northern Witches' factions. They were either XXX's lovers or XXX's subordinate. Almost all the wizards were on the fringes of the power system. Grimm was now a Tier 2 wizard and the patriarch of the newly established Crimson family, so he and his subordinates had to lower their status to the witches and participate in this foreign plane expedition as vassals of the witches. Although this was reasonable, it was too shameful for Grimm. However, Grimm really did not care about this. He was a typical pragmatist who put profit above everything else. He was not as strict about his reputation as some of the chauvinistic wizards. That was why he accepted this condition without any difficulty. However, shamelessness in a foreign plane expedition was not enough. They also needed to be strong enough to protect themselves and fight. That was why selecting the members to participate in the expedition became the most important thing. The Tower of Destiny would definitely send all its members. Including Alice, there were only 8 witches, and they were all Grade 1. As for Grimm's side, the members that could be selected were Grimm, Grade 2 Fire Wizard, Mary, Grade 2 Vampire, Zachary, Grade 2 Lightning Dragon Person, Goblin Ripper, Grade 2 Magic Machine, controlled by Grade 1 Tigule, Dracula, Grade 1 Wind Wizard, Bliss, Grade 1 Insect Wizard, Ender, Grade 1 Poison Woman, Dana, Grade 1 Medusa, and Guja, Grade 1 Three-Headed Hound, the 3 Blood Knights, Pseudo Grade 2 Vampires, Venlier, Grade 1 Vampire, Gargamel, and the Forest Demon Ava were. responsible for protecting the blazing flame monarch with Charon's help. The goblin plane was left to Meryl. As for the lance plane, they could only rely on the grade 3 brain monster, Gaz Ruvi, and the powerful metal fortress to defend their territory. Suddenly running into a foreign plane, they were most afraid of being surrounded by the native tribes and fighting a war of attrition. In that case, even an extremely powerful magus could be tortured to death by a group of natives who were like ants. That was why, after selecting a batch of strong generals, Grimm began to work hard to assemble an elite army. As for the cannon fodder, apart from allocating 100 combat magic machines, Grimm also planned to expand his elemental puppet army. These days, most of the battles were carried out with an endless supply of combat magic machines. However, without Gaz Ruvi and the metal fortress, he would have to think of a way to obtain an endless supply of cannon fodder. Chapter 6:12. With the preliminary list of participants drawn up, Grimm returned to the metal fortress. The newly captured ice dragon had already been sent to the blazing flame monarch, and he was waiting for a suitable opportunity to trade it out through special channels. The Crimson family's name had already been established after the banquet, and it had left a deep impression on many magus families. Now, the goblin cabbie was making use of his private circle, using the blazing flame monarch's ability to provide high-quality dragons as a gimmick to slowly build up his brand. This made many magi who had returned empty-handed feel excited. They went to the blazing flame monarch every day, constantly inquiring about the details and timing of the next batch of dragons. Some wealthy magus families even provided cabbie with all the information they needed on the dragon's attributes and gender. They boasted that as long as the Crimson family could provide them with a dragon that met their requirements, they would be willing to pay any price. Cabbie was even more astute. In the goblin shop on the first floor of the blazing flame monarch's hall, he placed a dragon scale he'd pried off of the ice dragon Alantini. This way, magi who came to the shop only had to examine the translucent, milky white dragon scale, and they would be able to roughly deduce the density of the dragon's bloodline and innate attribute. In a short period of time, news of the blazing flame monarch obtaining a new dragon spread like wildfire. Many high-ranked magi sent their own representatives to the blazing flame monarch to discuss the purchase of the ice dragon with Gargamel and Cabbie. In a short period of time, the Crimson family stationed in the blazing flame monarch had even surpassed the 5 great families, becoming the hottest rising family in the central continent's Tower Forest region. However, all the magi who belonged to the Crimson family had gone into hiding, beginning a new round of seclusion. They would be embarking on a journey to a new plane in 3 months, and before that, there was far too much preparation work to be done. First of all, the latest batch of small-scale magic furnaces had to be completed as soon as possible. Not only did the Goblin Ripper that Tigul controlled need them as a source of energy, some large construction machines also needed the support of the magic furnaces. Hence, before entering the plane of Fairn, Grimm had to ensure the safety of the magi in his family. Secondly, after advancing to rank 2, Grimm had been busy with plane expeditions all day. His old job of refining and researching elemental magic puppets had been slack. Now that he was about to enter a mature, middle-ranked plane ruled by the gods, high-grade elemental magic puppets would become an indispensable support. Thus, Grimm had to use this last bit of free time to convert the high-grade elemental crystal cores he'd accumulated into necessary and suitable elemental magic puppet. This was the quickest way to increase his strength. Furthermore, in addition to these conventional methods, Grimm had also created the plague poison spirit and the sewing puppet, giving him 2 more methods to deal with his enemies. However, these 2 alchemy creations had their own independent souls and consciousnesses, so it would take a long time to nurture and nourish them in order for them to unleash their full potential. Therefore, he could only act as Grimm's assistant for now and could not be used as his main combat force. Additionally, 3 of the alien bugs with innate abilities that he had been nurturing in the blazing flame monarch's secret room had matured, and they were about to undergo the second phase of bloodline experiments. Grimm couldn't help but feel excited when he thought about how he could completely usurp the bloodline talent of a powerful race. Up until now, it had become extremely difficult for Grimm to rely on daily meditation to increase his spiritual force after entering rank 2. At the end of the day, the original owner of his body was just an ordinary human acolyte with limited talent. Grimm had relied on his perseverance and the help of the AI chip to quickly reach rank 2. However, at this stage, the rate at which his spiritual force increased slowed down, and even showed signs of stagnating. If he didn't have any special methods to assist him, grade 2 would be the limit of his current body. If he wanted to take another step forward, he would have to tamper with the origin of his soul or bloodline. Experiments on the soul and bloodline were extremely dangerous, and the slightest deviation would result in eternal damnation. Many Tier 2 sorcerers had turned themselves into something that was neither human nor ghost, all because of some mishap in the process of modifying themselves. Moreover, if this kind of problem involved the origin of one's soul or bloodline, it would be impossible to fix it even if one wanted to. The more changes they made, the more their soul and bloodline would deviate from that of a normal human, until they turned into a strange monster that no one could recognize. One of the main reasons why the Crimson family's Tier 2 dragons were so popular was because the dragon race possessed a powerful physique and bloodline that was universally acknowledged. If they could uncover the secrets of the dragon bloodline, any high-ranked magus would be able to open up a new bloodline development path. Ignoring the inheritance of the dragon bloodline, just the long lifespan and powerful elemental innate talent from the dragon bloodline were things that human magi envied. If they could turn themselves into a dragon bloodline magus, they would be the strongest among magi of the same rank. Moreover, the longer he lived, the more time he would have to advance. Coupled with the powerful elemental energy from their bloodline, it would be easy for them to defeat magi of the same rank. Bloodline sorcerers valued their bloodline power, elemental sorcerers valued their elemental power, and physique sorcerers valued their physical strength. That was why living dragons were the most sought-after bloodline creatures in the sorcerer world. Although titans, phoenixes, hydras, and behemoths were all bloodline creatures that were far more powerful than dragons, they were rare and hard to track. It was extremely difficult to capture them. That was why it was reasonable for dragons to be so sought after by high-ranked magi. The Sorcerer World. Wilning, the Northern Witch Territory. As the seat of the Northern Witch Council, Wilning was a neutral territory that stood above the major factions. Especially in the past few years, the witch factions had opened up a secondary plane portal in Wilning, which made the place more and more lively. Today was the day when the Pale Witch faction opened up their plane. That was why there was a large crowd on the road to Wilning early in the morning. When the ordinary caravans saw the arrival of the witch faction, they hid on both sides of the road early in the morning. The coachmen, handymen, guards, and other insignificant people all lay on the ground with their heads lowered, not daring to look up at the other party. Only the leaders of the caravans with noble titles could stand there and silently bow to welcome the other party. Under their respectful gazes, a convoy of extremely tightly wrapped black horse carriages rumbled past their eyes. The 4 horses that pulled the carriages snorted and moved forward with all their might, looking extremely exhausted. As the leader of Eddie's Chamber of Commerce, Sir Kingwell traveled this trade route all year round and was no stranger to such a scene. However, his youngest son, Finney, who followed him out for the first time, did not have such knowledge. He hid behind his father and secretly looked at the legendary witches team while gently pulling on his father's sleeve. "Father, which faction are these witches from?" Although Finney's voice was soft, Ed was still shocked. He quickly turned around and scolded him in a low voice. "Silence! Lower your head and look at the ground under your feet. Don't look directly at the carriages." At this moment, a group of black armored guards on both sides of the witches' caravans passed in front of the father and son. Ed hurriedly covered his youngest son's mouth with his hand and turned around to bow to the black armored guards. However, the black armored guards ignored Sir Ed in front of them and continued to escort the black carriages forward quickly. However, at this moment, a carriage in front of Ed and his son ran over the stones in the middle of the road. The tightly wrapped curtains were raised high, revealing a horde of terrifying monsters that were stuffed inside. From their appearance, they looked like a group of skinned humans that had been soaked in a stinky ditch for a few days and nights. Their entire bodies were pale, as if they had drowned. Their bodies were sticky and slippery, emitting a pungent stench. They had no eyelids, and in their deeply sunken eye sockets were a series of milky, cloudy eyes. They were so white that not a single bit of black could be seen. They seemed to be a group of inanimate objects, densely packed in the narrow carriage, not moving at all. However, when little Feeney's gaze landed on them, they immediately sensed a trace of the aura of a human being. Their slimy and slippery bodies abruptly shuddered, and began to writhe slightly as they frantically sniffed the aura in the air, becoming restless and uneasy. The commotion in the carriage had obviously caused a chain reaction. Soon, even the carriages around them began to shake violently. Occasionally, they could even hear the roars of some terrifying monsters. What's going on? Who startled these ghouls? Unknowingly, two young witches were sitting on flying broomsticks in the sky, hovering above the black carriage without a sound. Following a melodious and strange song, the restless carriages once again returned to peace, and the monsters inside once again went silent. It's the Witches of Death. The experienced and knowledgeable Sir Ed immediately recognized the two witches based on the style of their robes and badges. His legs gave way, and he sat on the damp soil in shock. Little Fanny, who had made eye contact with the ghouls, had already fainted. "Humph, useless fellas. If you alert those big fellows in the other carriages, they'll definitely eat you all up. You, go inform the people at the front and tell them to pull back to a distance of 30 meters on both sides of the road." The witch in charge of guarding the caravan cursed in annoyance. With a soft whistle, she once again rode on her oddly shaped broom and flew into the sky. Chapter 6:13. The entrance to the Fernbit Wall was placed in an underground hall behind the Witch Council, and was jointly maintained by the Ceticilia family and the Pale Witches. As it was nearing the opening day, several other witches had sent their people to Wilning City one after another. The most surprising thing was that the Destiny Witches had also sent their people to participate in the plane invasion. This was the first time since the major witch factions opened their own private secondary planes. Therefore, their arrival was even more eye-catching. When the other witches were still driving the heavy carriages to Wilning City, a huge shadow suddenly flashed over their heads. When the witches of the escort team raised their heads in surprise, they were horrified to see a gigantic floating airship tearing apart countless clouds. It was like a metal castle floating in the sky, crushing down on Wilningshire City with an imposing aura that could shake one's soul. For a moment, dozens of witches suddenly rose from Wilning City, and confronted the floating ship from afar. "Who are you? Don't you know that this is the Northern Witches?" Among the many witches of the Ceticilia family, the leading witch had a terrifying grade 3 strength. When she strangely appeared in front of the floating ship, the huge metal warship inexplicably stopped in the air. But before she finished speaking, a familiar figure appeared on the spacious bow of the floating ship. "Lady Aurora, it's me." This voice was low and mellow. Although it wasn't loud, it seemed to have a peculiar charm to it. It actually caused Aurora, a Tier 3 witch, to widen her eyes in surprise. She exclaimed in disbelief, "Alice? It's you?" The dozens of apprentice witches around the Grade 3 witch, wearing the Ceticilia family badge on their chests, were all stunned. They silently stared at the beautiful figure that leaned out and nodded at them with a smile. That familiar starry robe, those beautiful and tall eyes, that silk-like smooth white hair, that gentle and firm gaze. It's Alice, it's really Alice. The leader of the Destiny Witches. Lady Alice, you are. Which Aurora could not help but hesitate. Since Alice was on the ship, it meant that they weren't enemies. But such a huge metal warship seemed to have never appeared in any of the witch factions. Why did their actions seem similar to those of the Silver Alliance? While the witch responsible for the safety of Wilning City was bewildered, a faint smile appeared on Alice's pale face. Elora, this is our ship. We're here to participate in the Pale Witch's Plains opening day. What, participate in the Plains opening day? For a moment, Herrera could not believe her ears. Ever since the Witch of Fate, Alice, handed over the world waymark of that large plane more than 70 years ago, witches of other factions also opened 1 or 2 private portals to their family's middle plane. They also welcomed witches of other factions to explore and develop the plane together. However, although these middle-grade planes had been colonized by them for hundreds of years, most of them still retained powerful and terrifying native forces. As for these family witches, they could only barely survive in the plane world as a foreign faction. Most of the territories they developed were isolated overseas, or in some extremely dangerous and hopeless situation. Using this method, they barely managed to keep a small stronghold and not be expelled by the natives of the plane inside. Even after thousands of years, they still did not complete the large-scale development of the private plane. Instead, they gradually integrated into the plane and became a local force that was half native and half invader. So, taking advantage of this opportunity, most of the witch factions contributed the Thorny Head plane that they had been developing with difficulty. They provided the portals and temporary footholds, and all the spoils of war obtained by other witch factions after entering would belong to them. Using this method, they could use the strength of other witches to develop a larger territory for their own family. Anyway, the plane would only be open for half a year to a year. Outside witches who did not leave after the time limit could no longer use the portals to get help from the outside world, let alone get supplies from the witch stronghold. Under the strangulation of the powerful native forces of the other plane, such a lone team of witches would sooner or later be reduced to ashes and become flesh and blood sacrifices for others. So, there was no team of outside witches who dared to violate this rule. It was precisely because of the cruelty and bloodshed of the conquest of the other plane that the slightly weaker witch teams would simply be courting death if they entered. So, among the 8 major factions of the Northern Witches, only the Fate faction, because Alice had just been resurrected for less than 100 years, had never sent anyone to participate in the other faction's plane opening day. So when Herrera, who knew the inside story, heard Alice's words, she was so surprised and shocked. Since Lady Alice is here to participate in the Pale Witch's plane opening day, then please park your ship at the 15th Street Square. Alice was obviously quite familiar with Wilning City. She turned her head and gave a simple order. The giant floating ship turned around like a deep-sea giant whale. Surrounded by countless apprentice witches of the Ceticilia family, it headed somewhere 3 miles away. When a huge floating ship with a body length of 120 meters and a ship width of 40 meters slowly descended from the sky, the people and vendors of Wilning City on the ground were all inexplicably shocked. They hid far away and silently watched this terrible metal monster. A dull thud was heard. The enormous body of the airship finally landed on the flat and solid 15th Street Plaza, crushing the thick green stones into powder one by one. One by one, the apprentice witches of the Ceticilia family rode on the flying broomsticks, silently floating in the sky around the floating ship. Each of them tightly held the glowing elemental magic wand in their hands. Strangely, the first to appear on the spacious metal platform of the floating ship was not someone else, but a group of short, green-skinned goblins wearing well-ironed leather clothes and trousers and wind-proof goggles. As soon as they appeared on the ship's platform, they screamed and waved their arms excitedly at the witches in the sky. No one knew what they were shouting. Just when the apprentice witches were puzzled, the cabin door opened again. This time, it was the real northern witches who walked out of the cabin. The 7 Destiny witches followed closely behind the leader Alice. They walked out of the cabin in an orderly manner and came to the position of the bow of the ship. Seeing the witches come out, the goblins did not dare to make any noise. One by one, they hurriedly ran to both sides of the platform, holding a strange glow stick in their hands, and began to operate and command. In the next second, when the cabin door on the side of the floating ship's hull opened, a team of strangely shaped, tall and mighty metal puppets walked out of the inside with heavy step. As they walked, the ground of the entire 15th Street Square began to tremble slightly. This was a group of strange and ferocious metal monsters. The armor on their bodies was more than 10 centimeters thick, and their bodies shone with a faint blue luster, which was a unique phenomenon of magical metals. They had a variety of shapes, and could be roughly divided into 3 types. The first type was defensive magic equipment with especially thick and solid armor. They held a huge metal tower shield in one hand and a thick chain hammer in the other. As they walked in unison, the dust and gravel on the square's blue stones kept shaking. Even the stone buildings on the periphery of the square began to tremble under the pressure. The second type was some strange magic equipment with slender and light bodies, but their bodies were covered with strange muzzles of various sizes. For some reason, when the apprentice witches saw these black muzzles, they could vaguely feel a suffocating murderous aura. The first 2 types of magic equipment occupied almost 90% of the magic equipment army in front of them. Behind them, 3 more strangely shaped magic equipment with a layer of translucent energy lingering around their bodies walked out of the cabin step by step. The one in the lead was the first genuine magic machine warrior that Grimm had just created after expending a great deal of effort, Mechanical Pioneer, Grade 2. It was a new magical mechanical warrior equipped with the Blitz Perception System, Magic Ray Gun, Gravity Interferometer, Energy Heavy Cannon, and a small magical furnace as its power source. Grimm did not completely hand over this abnormally powerful magic equipment to Gazravito. Instead, he used the most ancient goblin control method to fight. However, the magic equipment in the past was complicated to operate, and the magic equipment could only perform some simple body movements, so it could not be considered a qualified magic equipment. However, after this mechanical pioneer was equipped with Britz's perception system, the Tier 1 gnome mechanic Tigule could hide within it. He did not need any joysticks or control platforms. He could perfectly control this powerful magic machine with just his consciousness. The remaining 2 magical machine warriors were the improved Goblin Tinkerer and Goblin Warrior. The magic weapons installed on their bodies were not as powerful as the mechanical pioneers, and the core energy source was also a small space furnace, not a small magic furnace. If the goblin mechanic's strength was taken into account, their strength was much weaker than the mechanical pioneers. After a comprehensive analysis and evaluation, these 2 could barely be considered as pseudograde 2. Everyone who witnessed the scene could not help but hold their breaths and widen their eyes when they saw 100 battle magical machines equipped with metal constructs lined up in a neat formation on the plaza. Chapter 6:14. Bringing a bunch of metal puppets to fight in another world? The witches present first gasped, then lowered their heads and snickered. Every witch was well aware of the strength of the metal puppets, which were wrapped in tens of centimeters of high-strength alloy. The 100 metal puppets in front of them were more than enough to flatten a large human city with a population of several 100,000. But so what? With so many metal puppets, the amount of magical crystals consumed was also extremely shocking. Using them to fight against the armies of the mortals was indeed invincible. But what about after the battle? Could the broken armor and weapons seized from the battlefield make up for the magical crystals consumed to control the puppets? If they couldn't even make ends meet in every battle, then what was the value of conquering other planes? So in any wizard's pagoda of a northern witch, there would be a large number of steel golems, metal puppets, wizard beasts, and construct creatures. But they could only be placed inside the wizard's pagoda as part of the wizard's pagoda's defense system. They could rarely be placed on the battlefield. Otherwise, just the consumption of magical crystals alone would be a headache. As for organizing them into a terrifying steel army to be used as cannon fodder in war, that was an even more extravagant and wasteful thing to do. So looking at Alice bringing such a huge group of metal puppets to Wilning City, the trainee witches of the Ceticilia family all had a strange expression on their faces. But before the sneers on their faces faded, a few tall figures that had just come out of the cabin attracted their attention. This was a group of foreign wizards and their followers. There were men and women, and there were as many as 12 of them. What surprised the witches of the Ceticilia family was that there seemed to be more level 2 wizards in this group. One had to know that in most wizard families, level 2 wizards were already the core of the family. Unless something big happened, it was rare to see them. Among the group of people in front of them, there were only 6 wizards, but the number of level 2 spells already accounted for half of them. Looking at the tyrannical bodies and wild and domineering aura, all the trainee witches could not help but be secretly shocked, driving their flying broomsticks to fly backward. "Alice, what's going on? Why are there so many magi outside?" The Aurora witch flew over again and questioned Alice with a frown. After all, Vale would rather be the headquarters of the Northern Witch Council and the place where the leaders of the witches held holy meetings. Usually, they would not allow any wizards other than the Northern witches to enter this place. Now that the witches had gathered, it was even more impossible to allow the magi outside to wander around. They are all peripheral magi of the Tower of Destiny. This time, they will be following us into the Fairn Plain. Alice pursed her lips into a smile as she explained. Aurora glanced at the group of sorcerers. Sure enough, she could see the scale emblem of the Destiny witches on their chests. This, Herrera pondered for a moment. Although she knew that there was something wrong, she could not find any loopholes in Alice's words. Almost every witch tower had more or less wizard. Their status was obviously lower than that of witches of the same rank, and they were marginal figures in terms of power. Therefore, it was normal for there to be some wizards in the witches' team. However, in the team in front of her, it was obvious that the peripheral magi were the leaders. The Destiny witches were more like a supporting cast. Therefore, for Herrera, who had always regarded witches as the highest authority, this was a strange feeling that the sky had turned upside down. But to insist that Alice was at fault, it did not seem to be enough. For a moment, Herrera's expression was strange and complicated. She could only lead Alice and the others to the underground teleportation hall. The Fairn Plain. This was an exceptionally beautiful medium-sized plain. The entire surface area of the plain occupied more than 40% of the surface area. In the vast and boundless ocean, there were many islands and small continents scattered like stars in the sky. Among them, the 2 largest continents were dominated by humans and elves. The 2 continents were separated by a vast ocean, and only large ocean-going ships could travel between them. The Pale Witches had invaded this plain for more than 1,100 years, but unfortunately, they had never been able to gain a stable foothold on the 2 main continents. The Fairn Plain was a top-notch medium-sized plain, with 2 continents and a vast ocean as its foundation. There were already some powerful local gods, and naturally, the 3 main god systems of the sea, humans, and elves were formed. Among them, all the sea creatures, including the ocean empire that ruled the vast territory, believed in the same powerful god, the sea god Dionysus. This sea god Dionysus, according to the Pale Witch's assessment, should be a powerful guy with level 6 strength. And under his command there was the sea beast god Atri, level 4, and the shallow bay god Sintra, level 3. In addition, there were some small gods with strength of no more than level 2. And in the Callan continent ruled by the Elven Empire, there lived as many as 34 million forest elves. They all believed in a powerful nature god, the elven god Sylvia. Sylvia was also a frightening god with level 5 strength, and under her command were the god of archery Marco, level 4, the god of rangers Eisner, level 4, the god of luck Vicenna, level 3, the forest origin Jurga, level 3, the god of moonlight Mivi, level 3, and many demigods and divine creatures. In comparison, the Faern continent where humans lived was larger, had a larger population, and was richer in resources. However, it was a pity that it did not produce a powerful enough human god. Instead, many lesser human gods were born, such as the god of war Karl, the god of strategy Blake, the god of assassination Kayla, the god of wealth by Ning, the god of justice Dan Fight. Their believers and followers wandered all over the continent, working hard to spread their faith. Thus, it formed an intricate and strange situation where they coexisted with each other. In the Faern continent where humans lived, almost every city or village had multiple religions coexisting at the same time. They fought and ostracized each other, but magically formed a parasitic relationship where they coexisted and thrived together. In this strange and huge world, it was so difficult for the native forces to survive, and the Pale Witches, as invaders, had an even harder time surviving. More than 1,100 years ago, the Pale Witches locked onto the Faern Plain and broke into this world under the guidance of the great wizards of the Outer Realms. At that time, the Pale Witches invaded the Faern continent under the rule of the elves. Unfortunately, it had been built into a powerful elven empire by the elven god. The first invasion of the Pale Witches suffered a head-on blow from the elven gods and the elven empire. The two sides fought a bloody battle on the elven continent. The Pale Witches killed as many as 5 elven gods, and although they were all level 2 and 3 gods, they also inflicted heavy losses on the elven god. Even the level 6 elven god Sylvia was forced to fall into a 1,000-year slumber. On the other side, the Pale Witches also suffered terrible losses. Of the 2 great wizards of the Outer Realms, one was killed and the other was seriously injured, barely came out to repel the attack of the elven gods. The Pale Witches, on the other hand, lost a double-digit number of family wizards, and finally had to withdraw from the elven continent, falling to a place called Shadow Island to survive. On Shadow Island, the Pale Witches erected a tall wizard tower, built a cross-plane teleportation circle, and received some military reinforcements from the Sorcerer's World. This was barely enough to defend the first forward camp. In the next 1,000 years or so, every time the Pale Witches accumulated enough strength, they would try to launch an invasion war on the Elven continent or the Faern continent. They used the means of war to plunder villages and cities on the 2 continents in order to seize the resources they needed. After all, the Faern Plain was a top medium-sized plain, and its own strength was large enough. With the strength of the Pale Witches alone, it was difficult to expand the results of the war and seize more land and resources. So when the Witch Council proposed to share some of the resources, the Pale Witches also went with the flow and contributed the Faern Plain. Anyway, the teleportation mark of the plane was in their hands, using the strength of other witches to open up territory for themselves. Why not? As for the resources paid, it was obviously nothing compared to the land and population of the Eternal World. Hence, on this day, the towering Magus Tower on the lonely Shadow Island suddenly lit up with an intense Magus light. Streaks of witchcraft halos stirred the air around the island like a tide, rippling outwards layer by layer. The thick mist that gathered around the Shadow Island all year round was pushed further away by this strange force, and it also allowed the bright sun in the sky to shine on the island-protecting wizard formation of the Shadow Island, which was full of sharp crisscrossed reefs. When the overflowing wizard aura of the wizard tower reached its peak, a huge teleportation gate slowly opened in the center of the Shadow Island. At this moment, countless pairs of strange eyes around the Shadow Island were silently staring at everything. Due to the existence of the island-protecting wizard formation and the terrifying wizard pagoda, They did not dare to go deep into the Shadow Island, and could only stay on the surrounding small islands or reefs and wait silently. Ahem, go back and tell the priest that the witches are making a big move again. It seems that another massacre is coming to our Farron Plain. A strange murloc spied on everything in the distance, sensing the strong aura of space, and could not help but sigh as he instructed. Chapter 6:15. For the major forces of the Farron Plain, the isolated Shadow Island was simply a tumor of the plane. These evil witches from another plane occupied the Shadow Island, relying on the geographical advantage and the powerful wizard tower to resist the attacks of the merfolk, elves, and humans for 200 years. In the end, the elves and the humans had to give up this terrible war that almost dragged down the two races, and instead used the method of siege to isolate the witches from the main continent. After hundreds of years of confrontation, even the merfolk had to recognize the existence of the witches, and gave the Shadow Island and the surrounding hundreds of miles of sea to this group of foreign witches, but forbade them from stepping out of the Shadow Island. Therefore, in the next 500 or 600 years, the Shadow Island was simply the most terrible evil place in the Farron Plain. Every year, there would be countless evil people who could not survive in the Elven continent or the Farron Plain, and ran thousands of miles to the Shadow Island to seek refuge with this group of pale witches. This, on the other hand, strengthened the witches' momentum and power. With the help of the contacts and channels brought by these local natives, the pale witches also made contact with many dark forces in the Farron Plain. Therefore, the pale witches provided them with some powerful evil witchcraft equipment, and these dark forces became the witches' peripheral eyes and claws, helping them to search for rare resources all over the continent. Both sides used each other, infiltrated each other, and the pale witches had become the most powerful underground dark force in the Farron Plain. And in these 100 years, every 10 years, the pale witches would choose to open up the Farron Plain. In this way, the northern witches who poured into the Farron Plain naturally became the allies and vanguard of the pale witches. They rushed into the Elven continent and the Farron Plain, looting wealth and resources everywhere, abducting the high elves and the merfolk, so they brought endless pain and disaster to the residents of the two continents. Therefore, the natives of the Farron Plain painfully called this disaster the Witch Disaster. After a long period of struggle, the wise and sages among the humans and the elves gradually found out the rules of the Witch Disaster. Every 10 years, the Witch Disaster would break out, and it would last about half a year or even a year. And during the Witch Disaster, as long as the necessary defenses and preparations were made, it would be possible to minimize the damage and disaster caused by the invading witches. And some of the local forces near the Shadow Island would also join forces to form an anti-evil alliance on the eve of the Witch Disaster, and send their respective armies to fight the witches. And this year, it had been a full 10 years since the last Witch Disaster broke out. Due to this reason, all the major forces in the vicinity were on high alert. They used all kinds of methods to send countless spies around Shadow Island so that they could be the first to know when the Witch Disaster would break out. And the most obvious prelude of the Witch Disaster was the opening of the teleportation portal of the upper plane of the Shadow Island after another quarter of an hour, when the energy sent by the Wizard's Pagoda gradually began to stabilize. The first batch of witches who crossed the teleportation portal slowly appeared. They didn't come alone. Instead, they drove a black carriage, and as if crossing a water gate, they easily passed through the planar teleportation portal from the Magus World's Wilming City to the Shadow Island. The beasts pulling the chariot weren't ordinary horses, but wizard beasts with magical auras. With the wizard barrier supported by the Wizard's Pagoda, the dimension suppression of the Shadow Island was weakened to the lowest level, so the witches who crossed over on the carriages did not show too much of a physiological reaction. Even the servant beasts did not seem to be affected much, and were still jumping around, trying their best to pull the carriages, transporting carts of supplies and resources to the Shadow Island. There were 6 Death Witches, led by a level 3 witch, and the rest were a level 2 witch and 4 level 1 witches. In addition to the witches, they also brought up to 200 mid-level and high-level undead, including 140 elite ghouls, 20 high-level mummy elders, 5 shadow dwarf assassins, 15 wraith banshees, 5 evil zombie dragons, 5 hard bone dragons, 10 undead knights. These were also the cannon fodder that they had specially prepared for this dimensional war. The Winter Witches sent 5 people, 1 level 2 and 4 level 1. They were transporting 100 Frost Guards, which were special wizard beasts that were transformed from ice creatures. As for the witches of the other factions, they also sent a sizable wizard beast army. As the teleportation portal continued to absorb and release, the huge teleportation portal almost filled up the huge teleportation portal. Death Witches, Winter Witches, Pain Witches, Pale Witches, Dark Witches, Illusory Witches, Deceiving Witches. After the wizard beast army of the 7 great witch factions arrived, a strong light suddenly erupted from within the teleportation portal. This dimensional teleportation portal that was formed by countless wizard runes and law chains seemed to have swallowed a piece of meat that was thicker than its throat, stuck there, unable to swallow or spit it out. The teleportation portal that had been stable just a moment ago immediately rippled, seeming to be shaking. D***M*, what's going on? Didn't all the witch teams teleport over? Why is there a big guy? Quick, get the wizard's pagoda to expand the space fissure. If we let that be starred over there blow up the dimensional door, the entire teleportation portal will be destroyed. Under the stern urging of the guarding witch, the wizard's pagoda not far away trembled slightly, once again increasing the energy supply. As the planar teleportation gate expanded bit by bit, there was a soft pop, and a behemoth-like metal object appeared in front of everyone. What is this? This was the first time she had seen such a huge metal object, and the guarding witch was so shocked that she could not even speak properly. Don't get excited, this is a giant airship. It should be a creation of the Silver Alliance. But the Fairn Dimension is only open for the Northern Witches. Why would an airship of the Silver Alliance appear here? This time, it was a level 3 Pale Witch who had appeared. She had a pale face, long silver-gray hair, and held a mysterious wizard staff with a strange shape in her hand. The level 3 witch who had led the Witches of Death here clearly knew this Pale Witch. She shook her head and explained, "Uzel, you've been in the Fairn Dimension for too long. I'm afraid you don't know that the Destiny Witches have returned. This airship was brought by them. Don't think that I'm so ignorant. You're talking about that little lass called Alice, aren't you? A Tier 1 brat actually managed to climb to the position of leader of the Fate Witches. Kaki. Sure enough, the Fate Witches are existences that outsiders will never be able to fathom." Uziel couldn't help but laugh strangely as she spoke of her excitement. When the giant airship finally passed through the teleportation portal with difficulty, the giant door of light finally collapsed with a violent tremor. Berserk and disorderly magic currents collided in the teleportation plaza, but they were all blocked by the defensive spell formation that rose up. After a full quarter of an hour, the violent turbulence finally subsided, allowing the people in the teleportation plaza to heave a sigh of relief. "All the witches who have led the teams here, follow me to the 7th floor of the Wizard's Pagoda for a meeting," which Uzel called out softly. At this moment, Grim and Alice had just stepped out of the metal cabin of the giant airship. Hearing this, they looked at each other and left the problem of accommodation to others. Only then did they slowly follow the other witches to the powerful wizard tower that stood tall in the center of the Shadow Island. The Shadow Island was an island isolated in the sea. There was no other volcanic island more suitable for a permanent base within 1,000 miles. The wizard tower stood on the giant crater, using the powerful underground fire energy to provide a large source of energy for the wizard tower. The area of the Shadow Island was not too large, only about 70 square kilometers. Other than the volcanic dust pillars that did not disperse all year round, the outer area of the Shadow Island was also covered by a large amount of water mist. Therefore, most of the time on the island there was no daylight and the sky was always gray. The Pale Witches naturally all lived in the tall wizard's pagoda, never having to worry about the harsh environment outside. However, those who came to the Shadow Island to seek refuge with the wicked, which could only build simple wooden houses on the edge of the island and live the life of a fisherman with a pure heart and few desires, the Pale Witches would not be kind enough to provide them with food and water. If they wanted to survive in this harsh environment, they had to find their own water and food, or steal everything from others. As for the supply ships that came from afar, they could only come once every 2 or 3 months. So in the pigpen walled city of the Shadow Island, blood and killing became a daily necessity. The meeting was held on the 7th floor of the wizard's pagoda. When Grimm and Alice followed the witches here, they immediately saw a huge projection of the Fane Plain in the middle of the hall. On the huge Fane continent, the terrain of the continent was winding, with tall and undulating mountains everywhere, some winding for tens of thousands of miles, some rugged and steep, with strange peaks. Human cities, towns, and villages of various sizes were scattered all over the place. Together with the rivers and lakes that were scattered all over the place, it formed a perfect picture of the human world. On the other side of the huge elven continent, there was a dense sea of undulating forests. Looking from afar, it was a huge forest completely overturned by tall ancient trees and countless green plants. Grimm immediately scanned the 3D projection of the Fane Plain into the AI chip in a special way, then quickly reconstructed the model and compared it. Chapter 6:16. It was a group of spirits. To be more precise, it was a group of powerful spirits that were associated with the Pale Witches. The reason why the Pale Witches were so powerful was because of these terrifying spirits that were parasitic with their souls. Any enemy who wanted to fight the Pale Witches had to face 2 powerful opponents whose souls were interlinked and of one mind. One had a body of flesh and was proficient in elemental or curse-type spells. The other was a complete spirit that was immune to most physical damage. When the 2 were combined, they formed a complete Pale Witch. It was precisely because of the strength and independent consciousness of the companion spirit that the Pale Witches often regarded each other's companion spirit as themselves. Wherever the spirits went, they enjoyed the same benefits and treatment as their main bodies. And now, walking into the mission hall was actually a group of Pale Witches' spirit. It seemed that the witches were busy with other matters, and had left the task of receiving their allies to this group of spirits. There were a total of 5 spirits that entered the hall. 1 was rank 4, 2 were rank 3, and 1 was rank 2. The one who spoke was naturally the rank 4 spirit. This was a beautiful young woman dressed in a gorgeous court dress. If placed in any human noble banquet, she would definitely be the main character of the banquet. Under a light, low-cut skirt were 2 round, creamy mounds of flesh. Her skin was as white and delicate as ivory, and on her exquisite and perfect face were 2 faint blushes. To be honest, if not for the data projected by the AI chip clearly indicating her identity as a spirit, even Grimm would have unconsciously treated her as a real human. I am Lilith, the highest-ranked witch of the Pale faction stationed in the Fane Plain. First of all, please allow me to welcome all sisters to the Shadow Island of the Fane Plain. There was a burst of warm applause. In order to coordinate the development of the Fane Plain, we, the Pale Witches, have specially formulated a new battle plan. In 7 days, the Shadow Island will be divided into 2 routes to invade the Elven continent and the Fane continent. Although all of you have come to the Fane Plain to collect resources, it is best to move with our team here. It is safer and safer. If any of the sisters wants to move with us, you might as well report the target to me now. I will arrange the specific route accordingly. After listening to Lilith's request, the few witch representatives present could not help but lower their heads and ponder. Callan continent. The first one to speak was the representative of the Dark Witches. Since someone had spoken up, the other witch representatives did not hide it anymore. Fane continent, Fane continent, Fane continent, Ocean Empire. There were as many as 5 witch factions heading to the Fane continent, which was less ruled by humans, while only 2 factions headed to the Callan continent, which was ruled by the elves. However, the most surprising thing was that the hypocritical witches had actually chosen the Ocean Empire. Lilith frowned and pondered for a moment before finally speaking. Since more of our sisters have chosen the Fane continent, then we, the Pale Witches, will also use the Fane continent as the main battlefield for this invasion. The Callan continent will only be responsible for Feint. Therefore, the sisters who chose to go to the Callan continent had to bear some unknown risks themselves. In addition, the Ocean Empire has recently signed some friendly agreements with us, so if you hypocritical witches cause any trouble in the Ocean Empire, you will not receive any help from us. Many of the witches were already prepared for such a stance, so they did not raise any objections. Very well, since everyone has accepted this plan, then you can rest and adjust in Shadow Island for the rest of the time, and eliminate the effects of the plane suppression as soon as possible. In 7 days it will be time for us to act together. Also, if you need detailed information and maps of a certain area in the Fane Plane, you can visit Lady Rita. If you want to make some special spiritual weapons, you can visit Witch Uziel. Okay. That's all I need to say. After saying this, the beautiful Lilith left the mission hall without looking back. Grimm and Alice discussed for a while, and Alice went to find Lady Rita and bought detailed information about the entire Elven Empire and the Callan continent from her. The price was 30,000 magic crystals. This time, Alice's target was a powerful divine weapon in the hands of the elves. In order to avoid revealing the main purpose of this trip, Alice could only buy all the information vaguely. Prophecy Scepter. This was a low-grade divine weapon that had the powerful power to see through the fate of the world. Anyone who wielded this staff would be able to sense a tiny voice whispering in their ears at all times, as if it was silently telling them the secrets hidden behind the world. But for those who did not have the gift of prophecy, this voice was a terrifying demonic sound that could drive them crazy. They wanted to hear it, but could not hear it clearly, and could not block it out even if they did not want to hear it. Day and night, all the time. But when this prophecy scepter fell into the hands of the wise and sages, it could reveal the true side of the world that was hidden by the laws of the plane. If Alice wanted to advance to Grade 2, she had to obtain this prophecy scepter and seal it into her card of fate. This was also the only path of survival that had been pointed out to her by 3 consecutive fate divinations. Of course, there were other ways to advance, but with Alice's current vitality, she could not take them. Therefore, even if this path of advancement was filled with difficulties and endless killing intent, Alice could only grit her teeth and walk forward step by step. Before coming here, Alice had only divined that this prophecy scepter was in the Elven continent, but she did not know who had it. Therefore, after analyzing and summarizing the information that she bought, Grimm and Alice were a little dumbfounded. If the information that Lady Rita sold them was correct, the prophecy scepter was most likely in the hands of a powerful demigod of the dragon race. In the Fane Plane, a powerful demigod of the dragon race often meant that he was a Grade 2 dragon. There were dragons in the Callan continent ruled by the forest elves. This information was not wrong. It was said that there were about 20 dragons living in the Callan continent, most of which were low-grade green dragons, but there were also a few very powerful emerald dragons. The prophecy scepter that Alice wanted was the collection of a Grade 2 green dragon, Ogo. Although the dragons were naturally arrogant and did not like to live with other races, there were still some special races that had some close ties. The forest elves were natural creatures, and the emerald dragons and green dragons were also dragons that liked nature and lived in the big forest. Therefore, in many planes, these two races naturally had a good impression of each other. In the magic forest ruled by the forest elves, a large piece of forest land was specially designated for the emerald dragons and green dragons to live in. In order to win over these two kinds of dragons, the forest elves specially built tall dragon cliffs, and then used countless treasures and mountains of gold coins to decorate the dragon's residence. Therefore, after enjoying a large number of offerings from the forest elves, these dragons were also willing to fight for the elves. Some of the dragons even became excellent partners and friends with the forest elves, which led to the relationship between the two sides becoming closer. After understanding this, Alice painfully discovered that if she wanted to deal with the green dragon named Ogo, she had to include the forest elves. Otherwise, any battle plan would be out of control because of the intervention of the forest elves. However, what troubled Grimm and the others the most was not how to fight, but the lack of local natives who were extremely familiar with the Callan continent. Therefore, Grimm had to turn his attention to the group of evil people living on the Shadow Island. Salted Fish Tavern. It was just dark, but the tavern was already overcrowded. Pushing open the two old broken double doors at the entrance of the tavern, Grimm had just taken a step forward when he was greeted by the noise and frown. What was even more difficult for him to accept was the hot air, the pungent fragrance of cheap cosmetics, the stench of sweat, and the unique fishy smell of salted fish left for a long time. The living environment that the pale witches provided for these foreign heathens was not very good. There were no solid, comfortable rooms, no fragrant food, no warm water for bathing. They ate bread made from fermented old and rotten wheat and drank poor-quality wheat wine. The only meat they ate was fish. Therefore, almost all of the heathens living on the Shadow Island had a strong fishy smell. When they gathered in the only salted fish tavern on dark Shadow Island, they were roasted and stirred by the sweaty and heat waves. The pungent and terrible stench was enough to kill an ordinary person who stepped in for the first time. Of course, Grimm was not an ordinary person. With his Grade 2 elemental incarnation, he would not die even if he was thrown into the world's most terrifying volcano. Of course, he would not be killed by the stench in front of him. Grimm simply held his breath and stood at the door, casually glancing at the crowd. The place was full of disheveled, ragged vagrants, murderers, and all kinds of criminals. Looking at their races, there were humans, barbarians, dwarves, snake people, and half-elves. The reason why Grimm was sure that they were half-elves was because he had already seen the pair of slender, pointy ears hidden under the tattered felt hats. Grimm's appearance had obviously attracted the attention of all the drinkers in the tavern. All of them maintained the posture they were in just a moment ago. They tilted their heads and stared blankly at this outsider who did not belong to their group. For a moment they did not know how to react. Although Grimm had put on a thick cloak over his robe, covering all the spirit runes and spirit runes, the cleanliness and tidiness of his body betrayed him, making him look different. We plan to go to the Callan continent in the near future, so we need some guides who are familiar with the local terrain. Do any of you have a suitable candidate? Grimm didn't try to hide his intentions and directly stated his request. *his***. Chapter 6:17. In the end, the one who stood trembling in front of Grimm was the male half-elf. His name was Tomo. According to him, they were born in the Callan continent. His father was a high elf, while his mother was just an ordinary human maid. In the magic forest of the Elven Kingdom on the Callan continent, the high elves were like human nobles, living a life of debauchery and debauchery. The birth of Tamer was just an accident. It was an accident caused by the high elf's master playing with a human maidservant after getting drunk. In the Elven Kingdom, the pure and flawless elven bloodline was very popular. Therefore, in order to purify the family's bloodline, his father, who was a high elf, decided to kill Tomo, who had just been born. However, Tomo's mother, the human maid, did not want her son to die, so she escaped the magic forest under the cover of the night. After wandering the Kalan continent for many years, when Tomo had just turned 14, they were once again found by the High Elf's men. After a fierce fight, Tomo's mother, the human maid, clung to the assassin's leg, giving Tomo a chance to jump off the cliff. His mother died under the assassin's sword, and Tomo escaped from the Kalan continent with wounds all over his body, becoming a sailor on an ocean ship. In the next 100 years, Tomo wandered around the Fane continent for a long time. In the end, he killed a great noble who tried to kidnap him to be a catamite, and was forced to leave the Fane continent, ending up on the Shadow Island. As a mixed-blood half-elf, Tomo had great balance and agility that ordinary humans could not compare to. His powerful racial talents also allowed him to successfully advance into the thief class, becoming a very famous godly thief. To be honest, Grimm was not interested in the tragic story of the half-elf Tomo at all. The only thing he was interested in was Tomo's hatred and understanding of the Elven Kingdom. Although Taimo had lived in the illusory magic forest for more than a decade, all he could remember was the contemptuous supercilious look and endless hatred. The Elven Kingdom was extremely xenophobic. The entire Elven Kingdom, from the king to the nobles to the lowest level of the Elven Kingdom, were extremely averse to outsiders. Especially towards humans, they had a bone-deep hatred for them. Humans cut down forests and destroyed vegetation. Wherever there were humans, the area of forests would rapidly decrease. Due to the difference in racial concepts, the production and survival methods of humans and most elves were vastly different, which led to all kinds of contradictions and conflicts. After bringing the half-elf back to his residence, Grimm spent another day and night getting more detailed information about the Elven Kingdom from the half-elf. After all, this half-elf Tomo had traveled through most of the areas in the magic forest, and the information he provided was the best supplement and correction to the previous information. The entire Kalan continent was divided into different groups by the forest elves. Those who could live in the core area of the Kalan continent were naturally the noblest and most powerful elven families, while the weaker ones could only live on the edge of the magic forest. That area was adjacent to the coastline, and slave ships from the Fane continent would often dock there and attack some of the weaker elven tribes, bringing the captured forest elves back to the human society and selling them at a high price. Forest elves were all handsome and had delicate and graceful figures. They also had a strong exotic charm, so they were highly valued in the upper echelons of human society. An ordinary elven girl could be sold for an astonishing 300 to 500 gold coins in the human society. As for the high elves with combat and magic professions, they could be sold for a sky-high price of hundreds of thousands of gold coins. Therefore, living at the edge of the magical forest near the coastline was an extremely dangerous thing to do. Every year, hundreds of slave ships would sneak into the Kalan continent and attack an elven village before quickly retreating. Although most of the slave hunters would fall to the sharp arrows of the elven patrols, there would always be some lucky ones who would be able to pass through the densely packed defense lines of the Elven Kingdom and capture an elven village. All the forest elves, young and old, would be loaded onto ships and taken away. Under such circumstances, the enmity between the elves and the humans grew more and more intense. Now, it had almost reached the point where they would fight each other as soon as they met. After Tomo honestly told him everything he knew, he respectfully asked Grimm, "Lord Wizard, I wonder, where do you want to attack this time?" Dragon Cliff. Grimm sat by the wooden table and directly answered the half-elf's question, completely ignoring the widened eyes of the half-elf. On Grimm's body, there were two strange dolls the size of a palm, happily climbing up and down. One of them seemed to be made of simple and crude wood, and the inside of it was faintly emitting a creepy green fluorescence. The other was simply a black doll that was messily sewn together. The body was half male and half female, and there was only a single eye drawn with blood on the doll's head. It looked very strange and eerie. The two dolls didn't seem to get along, and they rarely came together. One of them was always lying on Grimm's left shoulder, while the other was floating on Grimm's right shoulder, playing by themselves. The way they played was also very strange. The plague poison spirit's wooden humanoid body did not seem to be a real one. Whenever it saw something it was interested in, it would stretch out its hand, and the wooden arm would instantly turn into countless tiny poisonous insects that were hard to see with the naked eye, wrapping around the item. The plague poison spirit would then determine whether the item was good or bad by putting it in its mouth and biting it. With the highly poisonous power of the plague poison spirit, any ordinary object would be corroded into ashes within a moment, even with a slight touch. Even those low-grade magic tools couldn't resist the corrosive power of this level of poison. As for the newly made puppet, its soul had only just begun to sprout, and it was still a little sluggish. However, when the terrifying bloody eyes turned, the half-elf Tomo, who was standing in front of Grimm, froze on the spot in a daze. His soul was almost pulled out of his body. In the end, Grimm used his palm to block their line of sight, and Tomo's mind returned to him. The half-elf shuddered, and no longer dared to look around. But in his heart, the terrifying Magus reply was still echoing. Dragon Cliff. Dragon Cliff. The enemy's target was actually Dragon Cliff. As an outsider, he might not understand what Dragon Cliff represented. However, as a half-elf who had lived in the magic forest for more than 10 years, Tomo was very familiar with the importance of Dragon Cliff to the forest elves. Because Longyear represented the strongest and most terrifying ultimate power of the elven kingdom. Out of hatred towards his father and the entire forest elves, Tomo immediately knelt in front of Grimm without hesitation, and vowed to do his best to help the wizards accomplish this feat. Grimm was satisfied, and allowed him to join the team. 7 days passed in the blink of an eye. After replenishing and recuperating on the Shadow Island, the majestic expedition fleet raised their sails, and according to the plan, they split up to attack 2 distant continents tens of thousands of miles away. And this time, the Witches of Destiny led by Alice had once again become particularly eye-catching. The huge airship that was filled with all the goods, resources, and magical equipment quickly rose into the sky and quietly hid in the thick clouds under everyone's gazes. The Dark Witches, who did not have a good relationship with the Destiny Witches, could only take the giant ship provided by the Shadow Island, and together with the Pale Witches, they traveled through the starry night towards the Kalan continent. A huge amount of magical energy surged inside the giant floating ship, and turned into a powerful force of wind, carrying the 10,000-ton all-metal giant ship silently across the sky. The terrifyingly powerful elemental airflow shattered the surrounding clouds, leaving behind a strange cloud path that looked like broken cotton. Through the gaps between the constantly flashing clouds, one could clearly see the azure sea rapidly passing by under their feet. Amidst the flickering light and passing shadows, 1 or 2 small islands filled with lush greenery could occasionally be seen, and one could also see cheerful seabirds circling above the islands. Unfortunately, before they could take a closer look, the scene in front of them would be left far behind, never to be seen again. Closing his eyes and feeling the magical aura of this mysterious world, as well as the strange laws of the plane that were different from the sorcerer world, Grimm's mood was unprecedentedly relaxed and comfortable. Although they had embarked on an incomparably dangerous journey, and although what awaited them was a bloody and cruel battle, for some reason, Grimm had great confidence in this journey. This was not arrogance, nor was it a prediction, but a kind of trust in himself and the team. After the influence and practice in the lance plane, the Magic Cattle's army had basically taken shape, and the Magic Cattle's army that he had painstakingly built was ready to go. Moreover, he had a few mysterious trump cards in his hands. Although this trip to the Kalan continent was dangerous, Grimm was still confident that Alice could achieve her wish. Isn't it just a prophecy scepter? Isn't it just a powerful grade 2 green dragon? Isn't it just a group of weak elves with the protection of a powerful god? So what? At this moment, in Grimm's heart, all his enemies were paper tigers. What he needed to do was to find the enemy's weak point that could be easily broken. Chapter 6:18. The Callan Continent. As one of the only two large continents in the Farne Plain, the Callan Continent was also a beautiful world with rich resources and many creatures. As far as the eye could see, the entire Callan Continent was covered in lush, dense forests. The ancient trees in the forest were tall and strong, easily dozens of meters high, and the huge canopies that stretched out were often acres in size. The branches and leaves of the ancient trees danced, and the vines coiled around them. All kinds of colorful and unknown birds stood on the branches and sang happily. The lush ferns and shrubs under the tree filled the quiet and dark woodland to the brim, making it difficult to find a place to rest. Ordinary people could hardly move an inch in such a magical forest. This was a remote area near the coastline of the Callan Continent. Only here did the tall ancient trees seem a little sparse. Even their heights were much shorter than the ones in the mainland. At the edge of the coastline, there were steep cliffs and large reefs everywhere. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks and washing against the shore was deafening, making people feel excited every time they heard it. The undulating waves on the surface of the sea sparkled. The blue sea, the blue sky, the green water, in addition to the boundless sea of trees, as well as the cries of apes and the roars of tigers that rang out from the forest from time to time, the beautiful natural scenery was pregnant with vigorous vitality and hope. However, at this time, a few black dots suddenly appeared in the depths of the forest. They stuck close to the undulating treetops and quickly approached from afar, arriving at this coastline. This was a team of silver Pegasus knights, unique to the Elven Kingdom. The Elven Knight was riding on a tall steed that was covered in a thin layer of soft silver armor and had a pair of wide wings on its back. The silver Pegasus, like its name, shone with silver light, and could be clearly seen from dozens of miles away. It had 4 broad hooves, a long, silver-dyed horse mane, a strong and vigorous body, and a pair of wide wings that could freely soar in the blue sky while riding the wind. This kind of Pegasus was a magical beast born in the depths of the magic forest near a special magic spring. It had the appearance of a horse, the speed of an eagle, and the noble and elegant temperament of a unicorn. Therefore, the forest elves deliberately domesticated this magical beast and used it as the mounts of some high-grade knights, forming the most eye-catching flying force in the Elven Kingdom, Silver Lightning. They may not be as fierce as griffins, nor as powerful as hippogriffs, but they had the fastest flying speed in the Callan Continent and the most eye-catching appearance. Well, the eye-catching appearance may not help in combat, but the Silver Pegasus Knights were still voted as the most popular combat profession among the elven girls in the Elven Kingdom. Almost no elven girl could refuse the invitation of the Silver Pegasus Knights to stroll in the forest and admire the scenery. Therefore, from all aspects, the Silver Pegasus Knights were the most elite troops of the Elven royal court. They were also the most favored and symbolic troops. Usually, the Silver Pegasus Knights and their reserve Pegasus Knights would only patrol near the Elven Kingdom. Pegasus Knights would only patrol near the Elven Kingdom. Their appearance here today meant that an important member of the royal family must have stayed nearby. Pegasus. There were 2 Silver Pegasus Knights and 3 reserve Pegasus Knights. When the Silver Pegasus Knights flew to the edge of the forest and were 3 meters away from the treetops, the leading Silver Pegasus Knight gently pressed on the back of the horse and jumped off. In order to reduce the burden of riding the Silver Pegasus, the Silver Pegasus Knights usually only wore some light silver soft armor and carried light weapons. They also carried a small number of javelins and a large number of arrows in the leather pouch on the back of the horse. At this time, the Silver Pegasus Knight didn't slow down. With a flap of its wings, it stepped on its 4 hooves and rushed into the sky, while the Silver Pegasus Knight gently fell down. This Silver Pegasus Knight clearly had the world's lightest and most agile body. His strong body stepped on a thick branch, and with a slight crouch, He leaped up, then gently somersaulted a few times in the air and landed steadily on the high cliff at the edge of the coastline. Hergus, wait for me. The other silver Pegasus knight who came with him obviously didn't have such an agile body and soft body movements. He could only pat the silver Pegasus beneath him twice, circling in the sky before flapping his wings to slow down and hover above the high cliff. Only then did the silver Pegasus knight cautiously jump onto the high cliff. Landing a little heavily, his silver leather boots stepped on the edge of the high cliff. Immediately, countless gravel tumbled down the cliff and fell into the foamy waves and reef. Sidaris, who was on duty for the first time, unwittingly broke out in a cold sweat. He patted his chest a few times to steady his breathing before he strode to Higa's side. At this time, the silver Pegasus knight who jumped first had already pulled out a monocular that glowed with silver light, and began to silently scan the distant sea surface. Hergus, you're so brave. You dare to jump down from such a high place. Aren't you afraid of falling into the sea and becoming food for the fishes? While ridiculing his companion to his heart's content, Cadaris stuck his head out to look at the undulating waves and the dark, terrifying reefs below the cliff. Once again, he secretly patted his chest. With such a height and such dense reefs, he would definitely be smashed to pieces if he fell. Having lost the knight's control, the two silver Pegasus happily chased each other on the nearby treetops, while the other three Pegasus knights rode on their recently tamed Pegasus and found an empty space nearby to descend. They silently waited for the two Sir Knights' orders. As the noble silver Pegasus knights of the elven race, be it Cadaris or Hergus, they were both classic good-looking men. Their figures were tall and strong, with solid muscles and rosy skin. They had long grass-green hair, soft pointed ears, and a pair of blue eyes. They wore light silver soft armor and skirt armor of the same color. On their feet were a pair of silver leather boots, and on their waists hung two silver scimitars. Cadaris's skin was slightly fair, and his exquisite and perfect face carried a hint of childishness. His eyes were bright and twinkling, and he had an unforgettable lively aura. Although Hergus was equally handsome, his face was slightly stiff, and his every movement carried a trace of the coldness and capability of an iron-blooded soldier. Cadaris muttered a few more words in a low voice, but did not get a response from his companion. He could not help but ask loudly out of curiosity, "What's wrong, Hergus? There's no sea fog today, and you can see everything on the sea with a glance. Why are you still strenuously looking? Are you worried about those human slave ships?" Hergus silently put down the telescope and said solemnly in a deep voice, "I'm not worried about the humans, but those witches." Hearing his companion's reply, Cadaris blinked, not fully understanding. "I heard that too. It's time for the witch calamity to break out again. I'm afraid those witches will come from far away to harass us again. But the last few times have been much better. Those witches seem to know how powerful we are, and have invested most of their strength in the humans. Our losses these few times aren't that great." Compared to Cadaris's nonchalant attitude, Hergus was a little worried. "Cadaris, you don't know." Hergus hesitated for a moment, and finally said through gritted teeth, "I went to find Priestess Tia a few days ago." The moment he heard the name Tia, Cadaris immediately became nervous. He growled in a low voice, "You're crazy. How dare you come into contact with that crazy woman? Don't you know that people are calling her a black witch behind her back? It's said that the Elder Council is about to vote to expel Tia from the illusory forest. Are you trying to get in touch with her now?" Calm down, calm down. Let me finish." Hergus sighed. "I don't think Priestess Tia did anything wrong." "What did she do wrong? She's a subject of Silsa, and yet she went to study the power of those witches. Isn't that a huge mistake? But those hateful witches have been in our world for thousands of years, and have we ever driven them out? No. Not in the past, not now, and probably not in the future. Why? It's because they have magic that is far more powerful than ours, and it's the strange magic they call witchcraft. Hergus took a deep breath. If it's really as Priestess Tia envisioned, and Silsa's people can learn those powerful witchcraft, we forest elves might really be able to become the rulers of Faern. Leyland muttered. Hearing Hergus's explanation, Cadaris could not help but shake his head. Hergus, I think you've been bewitched by Priestess Tia as well. Don't believe her words. What, there's no good or evil in power, or it all depends on who controls the power. Don't believe her, Hergus. I feel that there are good and evil powers in this world. Witches may be powerful, but they can bewitch and corrupt people's hearts. Otherwise, how could they have done so many evil and terrifying things? Hergus was silent for a long time before he finally spoke again. Don't you want to hear what Priestess Tia learned after studying the books left behind by the dead witches for so long? Listening to Hergus's heavy tone, Cadaris had an ominous premonition. What did she tell you? She said that the witches who invaded our world were only a branch of a large force in the sorcerer world. The witch calamity, that has been happening more and more frequently in recent years, probably means that the forces of the witches have changed, and more witches have entered our world. Cadaris could not help but swallow his saliva with difficulty, and asked anxiously, So what does this mean? It means that our world has become the main target of the other party, and that there will be even more terrifying and evil enemies in this year's witch calamity. Blood Moon. Tia said she saw the blood moon. Towards the end, Hergus was almost roaring as he grabbed his companion's shoulders. Blood Moon. Chapter 6:19. Somewhere on the west coast of the Callan continent, the giant floating ship flew above the clouds at an extremely low speed. A few wizards belonging to the Crimson family walked onto the deck and leaned against the side of the ship, silently looking down at the magical continent that was faintly discernible below them. With their strength and the buff of the Eagle Eye spell, they could easily see through the thin layer of clouds and directly observe the strange natural landscape and the various types of jungle creatures in the Callan continent. Unfortunately, it was not as easy to find elves as it was to find humans. Humans liked to cut down trees near settlements to build tall and sturdy camps and buildings. Therefore, at night, as long as they followed the lights, they would naturally be able to find human villages and towns. However, the elves were known to be the closest to nature and the race that loved the forest the most. They almost never cut down trees, and instead, they naturally built their villages and towns on especially tall and thick ancient trees. Tree houses were the elves' living quarters. When night fell, the elves would rarely light open fires. Moreover, they lived deep in the mountains and forests, so it was almost impossible to find them with candlelight. On the other hand, people like Grimm and the others were flying high in the blue sky. Looking into the distance, all they could see was lush greenery. It was difficult to find a single color in the sea of undulating trees. Under such circumstances, it was impossible to find an elven village with just the naked eye. Therefore, if they wanted to find elves here, they could only go into the forest and jump high and low like the elves. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Tamo, can you recognize the terrain here? Before we start the war with the elven court, I hope we can hide this giant floating ship. Can you recommend a place? Grimm simply swept his gaze across the lush green forest and asked the half-elf guide. Of course, Grimm could not completely trust this guy who had joined them halfway. While waiting for an answer, Grimm silently called out the topographic map of the Callan continent in his mind and compared it with the long broken coastline in front of him. It seemed like it had been a long time since he last smelled the magic power in the magic forest. The half-elf Timo suppressed his excitement as he laid on the side of the floating warship and observed the forest beneath him. If I remember correctly, this should be the White Cliff, which is slightly south of the west coast. The most obvious sign here is the White Cliff rock that stands tall at the edge of the coast. Following Tomo's finger, Grimm saw a patch of white at the edge of the cliff. This is the area with the most complicated sea conditions near the west coast. The reefs are the densest, and it's also the most unsuitable area for large ships. Therefore, in this area, the probability of us running into the Elven King's patrol is extremely low. Tomo then pointed in a certain direction. Head in that direction, and you'll find an elven village in about 7 days. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the time needed to travel through the forest. As for riding on this big thing, it'll only take half a day. An elven village. Grim muttered to himself for a moment before shaking his head. It's not suitable for us to come into contact with the elves so early. We need to find a suitable place to settle down first. Tomo, are there any large metal veins or mines in the west coast? Metal veins? Tomo's jaw dropped in surprise. There are quite a few in the central part of the magic forest, but on the west coast. The half-elf lowered his head and pondered for a moment before gesturing with uncertainty. It's about 16 days' journey to the north from here. There seems to be a ratfolk mine there, but I don't know if there are any metal veins there. Then let's go there first. Grim immediately gave the order. A moment later, the floating warship ascended once more and dove into the clouds. It followed the direction that the half-elf had pointed out and quickly flew north along the coastline. When the gigantic floating warship completely disappeared, 2 elves drilled out from the lush crown of a tall ancient tree at the edge of the forest. They were wearing clothes woven from green vines. The 2 elves, one male and one female, stared at the spot where the metal monster had disappeared. Their eyes were filled with unconcealable shock. What was that? Was it another monster created by the witches? The female elf's voice was trembling. It was obvious that she had not yet recovered from the shock. It doesn't matter what it was. We have to send the news of the metal monster back to the village as soon as possible. Maybe Grandpa Winger can tell us the answer. The male elf made a prompt decision. All right, let's go. In the blink of an eye, the 2 elves disappeared into the crown of the tree behind them. Strangely enough, in the blink of an eye, they had blended into the forest, making it difficult for anyone to track them. A day later, the news about the appearance of a terrifying metal monster spread to every elven village on the west coast. The Ratfolk Mine. Tomo's 16-day journey was only a day and a night for the floating warship. If it wasn't for the fact that it took them 4 hours to locate the mine's entrance, Grim and the rest would have arrived much sooner. As the name suggested, the Ratfolk Mine was hidden in a dense forest. There was only a dark, slanted entrance to the mine, and a large tribe of ratfolk lived in it. The elves were a tribe that paid great attention to their appearance and cleanliness. It was impossible for them to work in a dark and damp mine that never saw the light of day. Therefore, the forest elves and the ratfolk in the mine reached an agreement. The ratfolk would hand over a certain amount of ore to the forest elves every year in exchange for the right to live in the mine. Therefore, not a single elf could be found in the ratfolk mine. The only ones living in the mine were intelligent ratfolk that were less than a meter tall. They could walk upright like humans, and they could use all kinds of sophisticated tools. These ratmen were too skinny to wear heavy armor, so they could only wear a metal cap on their heads. Then, they lit a thick candle on top of the cap, and used the dim light to move about freely in the dark and damp mine. The weapons of the ratfolk miners were pickaxes. Some of the stronger ratfolk warriors were equipped with powerful weapons such as machetes, iron swords, and spears. Based on Tomo's description, Grim could tell that the most powerful ratman leader was only a grade 1 ratman. The rest of the ratman warriors and miners were either high-grade apprentices or quasi-sorcerers. They didn't have any elemental power, and only knew how to scheme and scheme. Grim didn't want to send his precious wizard to deal with such trash. He only sent a goblin technician and 5 archer magic machines to break into the mine. Grim and the rest found a slightly flat area outside the mine and set up tables and chairs. After drinking 2 cups of hot tea, the battle in the mine was over. Almost 200 ratfolk, including the Rat King, were killed in one fell swoop. They were shot full of holes by the metal bullets of the magic machines. As for the metal crossbow bolts shot by the Ratman hiding in the dark tunnel, no matter if it was strength or attack power, it was not enough to harm the thick metal shell of the magic machine. Hence, after being suppressed, the archer magic machines easily slaughtered the entire group of ratfolk. The goblin technician brought back 4 or 5 ores that were mined from the depths of the mine. Grim casually picked up one of the ores and weighed it in his hand. He then raised it to his eyes to examine it. Beep. This is an ordinary ore. It contains 11% of the mineral content. The rest is useless waste. The mineral content is as follows: luo iron ore 1, 42%. Olivine ore 3, 27%. Pyroxene ore 2, 86%. Metal content is less than XXX%. Not worth mining or smelting. The AI chip gave a final evaluation after a long list of the mineral's composition. The quality of the ratfolk's mine was not high. Most of what they offered to the elves were topaz, olivine, agate, and other low-grade magic materials. These things were of some value to the elves, but they were useless to Grim, who was eager to establish his foundation. After inspecting the ores brought out by the gnome technician, Grim waved his hand in disappointment. Everyone boarded the floating warship again. The warship turned around and flew at high speed towards another mysterious mine in the distance. It could be said that in order to find a suitable metal vein as soon as possible, Grim was willing to do anything. After all, this was the border of the great magic forest. The Elven Kingdom could only send a limited number of troops here, and it was not enough to stop them. In another 5 or 6 days, the Dark Witches and Ashen Witches alliance would arrive at the Callan continent. At that time, they would become even more eye-catching and easy target. At that time, the Elven Kingdom would be more willing to send their elite troops to encircle them, and would not bring a group of elven troops to chase after the giant floating ship. In truth, with the sturdy ship and giant cannons, Grim no longer cared about the armies of the secular world. The only ones he was wary of were the elemental users and the powerful elves. Chapter 620. The Valley of Spears was unusually peaceful in the afternoon. Birds were singing and insects were chirping in the dark forest. A flock of brightly colored spotted birds were spreading their beautiful wings and flying happily among the branches. Mottled light shone through the gaps between the leaves, leaving a dazzling pillar of light in the air. Unfortunately, not only did the pillar of light not illuminate the forest, but it also made the Valley of Spears even more serene and deep. The Valley of Spears was a long, narrow, and sunken ravine. It got its name because it was shaped like a spear. In the deepest part of the Valley of Spears, there was an underground mine opened up by the kobold. It was famous for producing high-quality iron ores. Strictly speaking, this was one of the restricted military zones designated by the Elven Kingdom. Apart from the Elven convoys and kobold miners, no other races were allowed to approach or enter. Usually, the kobold's mine was too dark and deep, and it would collapse at any moment. That was why other creatures and beasts weren't willing to enter. Therefore, the kobold's defense was unusually lax. 2 kobold warriors could be seen with the naked eye in front of the huge, dark cave entrance. They were hugging their spears, leaning against the wall and dozing off. The towering cliffs on both sides of the Valley of Spears were still densely covered with tall, ancient trees. Their leafy canopies blocked the bright sun hanging high in the sky, leaving only a path of sunlight in the middle of the valley. However, in this tranquility, in the shadow of a tall ancient tree above the valley, a female elf wearing exquisite armor flung off her cloak and emerged from her camouflage. "Zack, will that metal monster really come to this desolate place to plunder? There's nothing in the kobold's mine except iron ores. Why would the witches want these metal lumps?" The female elf flipped her short green hair anxiously and turned to look at the ancient tree beside her. And at the place where the female elf was staring, the wrinkled and cracked bark of the tall ancient tree strangely protruded into a human shape. Then, it transformed into a male elf wearing green vine clothing, a deer helmet on his head, and an oak staff in his hand. He had thick eyebrows, big eyes, a straight nose, and a wide mouth. His green hair was twisted into thick braids that draped over his shoulders. Although he wasn't handsome, he had a wild and straightforward beauty to him. From its appearance, it could be seen that this was a special profession among the forest elves, a druid. According to the characteristics of the class, the druids were more of a combination of warriors and spellcasters. They possessed powerful nature spells. Not only could they cast spells, but they could also transform into a real magical beast at any time, using their powerful racial abilities and physical strength to fight against their enemies. However, most of the targets that druids could choose to transform into were wild magical beasts of the nature element, and they were unable to transform into another world. This druid named Isaac was also a Type 2 expert. He had come from the central mountain range to stop the metal beast. However, due to the lack of time, the druid order that he brought with him was not complete. It was only a third of his regular army. Even so, a team of 40 druids was a force to be reckoned with no matter which region they were in. Before I came, Commander Molina had already told me that we must figure out the enemy's strength and movement. The General Staff has analyzed the enemy's movements and found that they seem to be coming for the mines in Callan Continent. Along the way, they have already looted 4 wild mines. According to their last location and flight path, this cobalt mine is very likely to be their target. If the General Staff is so sure, why did they only send you here? Where's the Blade of Glory? Where's the Nature's Wrath archers? Where's the Silver Lightning? Where are they? It was no wonder that the female elf was so angry. At the end of the day, she was only a level 2 guard captain of a nearby elven town. She only had 100 or so warriors under her command, most of which were flower elves and sword dancers. Less than half of them were elite, level 1. Even though all the druids that Isaac brought with him were elite, there were only about 60 elite warriors in total. The female elf captain was a little nervous about ambushing the metal monster and the witch riding on it with such a force. There's nothing we can do about it. The druid Isaac shook his head. It's urgent. We've received accurate news that a large number of witch warships are approaching the east coast. The elite troops of the kingdom have been transferred to Silvermoon City in the east. The commander is worried that the metal beast is just a bait sent by the enemy to distract our forces. Otherwise, why haven't they attacked any elven towns yet? So before we figure out its basic strength, only the few of us can come here quickly. Then we should at least send the Silver Lightning or the Hippogriffs here. They can fly in the sky. If we don't have enough air power, how are we going to fight them? The female elf captain was still angry. The troops you mentioned have been transferred to the east coast to investigate the enemy's movements. They won't be able to make the long journey back in a short time. If the enemy really ambushes them and lands the metal airship, we'll find a way to rush up and occupy it. The druids I brought with me have all advanced and can transform into wind eagles. They also have a certain level of aerial combat ability. If the enemy has any aerial troops, leave them to us. But if necessary, we may need your long-range attacks as support. Hearing this, the female elf captain nodded silently. There were 20 elven archers in the garrison that she brought. Although they weren't as strong as the advanced godly archers, they had no problem in assisting with mid-range and close-range shooting. The only headache now was that they didn't know what kind of enemy was on the flying airship. What was more troublesome was that they were flying high in the sky and could choose any target to attack at will. Before they could confirm the enemy's target, the elves could only passively defend and be on guard. They couldn't gather their forces to fight effectively. Just like now, the female elf captain had to quietly hide here and wait for the possible enemy. On the other hand, she was worried about the Moon Shadow village that was 80 miles away. That was her hometown and also the place where she was born and raised. Now, the entire garrison of the village had been transferred here. What if? The female elf captain shook her head, trying hard to get rid of the terrifying thought in her mind. She pushed aside the luxuriant leaves in front of her again, and began to scan the azure sky in the west. Suddenly, the female elf captain's body trembled. She let go of the leaves and squeezed her body deeper into the canopy. Her blue eyes stared unblinkingly at the black dot that was gradually getting bigger in the west. Not daring to delay, the female elf captain raised her hands and cupped them around her mouth, shouting at the nearby forest with all her might. Amidst the rustling of the leaves in the forest, outsiders would only ignore such high-frequency shouts as background noises. Only natural creatures like the forest elves, druids, and flower elves would be able to decipher the long and obscure shout. The enemy is really here, and they're heading straight for the kobold mine. Upon receiving the female elf captain's order, all the elven warriors hiding in the dense forest on both sides of the Valley of Spears hid themselves. They pricked up their ears and silently waited for the next battle order. The female elf captain took a step back and lightly shook the elven cloak on her body, completely covering her armor and body. With a strange change of light and shadow, her figure perfectly merged into the surrounding environment and could no longer be distinguished. At the same time, the Grade 2 druid named Isaac had already used a camouflage spell to merge into one with the ancient tree. Unless the enemy happened to touch his body, no one would be able to find him by scanning his position. The floating warship glided across the sky at high speed. From afar, Tomo discovered the Valley of Spears that had a rather peculiar appearance. Under his command, the floating airship ejected dense wind elemental particles and slowly hovered above the kobold men's mine. The terrain of the Valley of Spears was too long and narrow for the floating warship to land. So, standing at the bow of the warship, Grim looked down and waved his hand to signal the warship to lower its altitude. Hence, under a gust of wind elemental particles, the floating warship began to descend along the center line of the Valley of Spears. Soon, it reached the same height as the rocky cliffs on both sides. At this moment, the dense treetops of the tall ancient trees on the cliffs brushed against the body of the floating warship, producing ear-piercing sounds of friction and snapping. The two kobold warriors guarding the entrance of the mine had long been awakened. Seeing the huge warship pressing down on them, they threw their spears away and barked as they fled into the mine. A dull thud sounded. The bottom of the floating warship touched the cliff, and the entire body of the warship trembled before finally coming to a stop. At this moment, the ancient trees on both sides of the cliff clustered around the warship, wrapping it tightly like swaddling a baby. At this moment, a small team of 10 came out of the inner cabin of the floating warship. 2 goblin technicians led 8 archer magic machines. On the deck of the warship, apart from the half-elf Tomo, there were only Grim, Bliss, and 2 destiny witches who came out to watch the fun. This was the first time they came to such a beautiful foreign world, and the 2 young witches who had never traveled far before were unusually excited. They had already decided to go to the nearby forest for a walk. In such a strange place, they might be able to find some rare plant specimens that could not be found in the sorcerer world. They might be able to get a lot of magic crystals back in the sorcerer world. However, just as Grim was about to order the exploration team to descend, the expressions of the 2 witches who walked to the edge of the ship suddenly changed, and they shouted, "Enemy attack!" At this moment, the sound of arrows piercing through the air came from the sky. Chapter 6:21. Enemy attack. Loud shouts resounded through the sky. Grim's expression instantly changed. The first wave of attack was not concentrated, with only 100 or so arrows at most. However, what was even more frightening was that these arrows were all enchanted feathered arrows. Asterisk whoosh whoosh whoosh, asterisk hundreds of enchanted arrows landed on the giant airship amidst ear-piercing screeches. The elves hiding in the dark were also very cunning. They actually let go of the 10 metallic battle magic machines and aimed their arrows at the wizards in cloth robes. Unexpected. Truly unexpected. Ever since they entered the Callan continent, their journey had been smooth sailing. Coupled with the fact that they had never had any direct conflict with the elves, Grim had unknowingly let his guard down. He did not expect to be ambushed on such a large scale in the wilderness where elves could not be seen. Furthermore, they were being attacked by enchanted arrows. Asterisk pft pft pft. Asterisk the sound of arrows piercing into flesh could be heard continuously. Grim and the other three were pierced by a dense number of arrows. The violent force of nature instantly tore their cloth robes into pieces. The 4 of them were in great pain, and their mouths were filled with blood. The 2 witches howled in pain and fell to the ground. Grim roared towards the sky, and his body instantly spewed out boiling lava and high-temperature flames that could corrode bones and corrode flesh. The enchanted arrows stuck in his body were roasted red in an instant, then softened into molten iron and flowed down. Grim had already completed the elemental transformation of his body and mind. Although this external attack made him feel very uncomfortable, it was still not enough to kill him. Furthermore, the insect Lich Bliss was a monster that was difficult to kill with physical attack. If not for the strange force of nature in the arrows of the elves, they would not even be able to cause a slight injury to Bliss. Hence, after withstanding the impact of the force of nature, the insect Lich Bliss stood up straight once more. He did not care about the densely packed arrows on his body at all. Instead, he stared with his ferocious compound eyes, his gaze locked onto the agile figures that were stepping on ancient tree branches and leaping towards the giant floating ship. Grim and Bliss were not seriously injured, but the 2 witches were completely different. They were obviously rookies who had just advanced not too long ago, and naturally did not have the terrifying life-saving methods that Bliss had. Amidst the dense rain of arrows, one of them had died while the other was heavily injured, and it could be said to be extremely tragic. Although one of the witches had been shot like a porcupine, her vitals had not been hit, so she was only seriously injured but not dead. The other witch, on the other hand, was not so lucky. Her body was full of arrows, but the most fatal one was the arrow that pierced through her forehead. Damn it, damn it, damn it! Grim couldn't help but roar furiously as he sensed a witch's life force rapidly slipping away. At this time, the enemy's second wave of arrows arrived. Kill them for me! Grim roared furiously. Amidst his earth-shattering roar, the insect Lich Bliss laughed coldly. His body suddenly exploded, turning into an uncountable swarm of black insects that charged towards the first batch of enemies. Although Grim wanted to rush forward and crush a few enemies to vent his anger, he could only force himself to calm down. He pointed at the dying witch on the ground and cast a flame shield on her. One had already died, and the heavily injured one could not die as well. Otherwise, it would be a huge loss. It had to be said that the main reason the elves' first wave of arrows could cause so much damage to the Magi was that the Magi were not prepared for it. Magi, in essence, were just a bunch of humans with powerful abilities. Without the protection of witchcraft, an arrow that hit a vital point could take away a wizard's life. However, once the Magi were vigilant and wrapped themselves in the protection of defensive spells, it would not be easy for the elves to kill them with long-range attacks. At least, the elves currently did not have the ability to kill an official magus with a single arrow. The second volley of arrows arrived once more. This time, they were destined to return empty-handed. The heavily injured witch on the ground had 3 flame shields around her. Although they trembled from the arrows enchanted with the power of nature, they did not shatter. As for the arrows that were shot at Grim, they quickly softened after entering his flame barrier, and then smashed into pieces on his suddenly expanding body. The enraged Grim immediately turned into a terrifying flame demon and strode towards the heavily injured witch, shielding her with his body. At this moment, Bliss, who had turned into a swarm of black insects, had already clashed with the first wave of enemies and started fighting fiercely. This wave of enemies were all bare-chested, wearing only a pair of tight leather pants. Their bodies were covered with strange magic runes, sword dancers. Sword dancers were a special profession for elven warriors. They could not wear armor and could only wear leather or cloth armor, so they were considered to be low armor or unarmored warriors. They wielded two long, narrow elven swords, and their bodies were covered with the unique runes of the sword dancers. These runes could increase their agility and reaction speed, but most of them had a strange ability to confuse the enemy's senses. When the sword dancers brandished their swords and charged into the enemy's formation, their flashing bodies and elven runes could deceive the enemy's vision, causing them to be unable to pinpoint the exact position of the sword dancers and their hand gestures. The sword dancers had almost no defensive abilities, and relied entirely on their high agility and nimble body movements to dodge the enemy's attacks, dealing a swift blow to the enemy when their swords clashed. The minimum requirement to advance to become a sword dancer was to stay in a dark room with 10 swinging metal balls full of sharp metal spikes hanging from the ceiling for a quarter of an hour. Hence, the most powerful ability of the sword dancers was their ability to dodge attacks. Unfortunately, this ability was useless against the insect lich Bliss. Without the protection of thick armor, the sword dancer could not stop the millions of insects from biting at him. Hence, the huge swarm of insects that gathered and dispersed were like tigers in a pack of wolves, completely ignoring the blades in the sword dancer's hands as they swarmed and crawled over his body. In just a few seconds, when the swarm of insects suddenly flew away, there was only a corpse that was completely green and had been bitten beyond recognition. Bliss's efficiency in killing was not high, but his pounces were accurate. In the blink of an eye, 7 of the 30 sword dancers on the deck of the floating airship had fallen. As for the sorrowful and indignant sword dancers, no matter how they swung their sabers, they were unable to stop the black insects from penetrating through. These damned magi! Sword dancers, spread out and leave this fellow to the druids. You guys go kill that fire person and the witch. A nimble female elf leapt onto the side of the airship and looked down at the battlefield, shouting out commands. As she roared, she quickly drew her bow and shot 2 arrows at the swarm of black insects. Unlike before, these 2 arrows were as fast as shooting stars, exploding into 2 huge fireballs the moment they came into contact with the black beetles. Many of the insects that the sword dancers had failed to surround were blasted to death by the fireballs, and insect corpses fell to the ground. The black insects shrieked and flew tens of meters away in an instant, condensing into Bliss's appearance in the air. However, compared to before, his body seemed to have shrunk a little, and he did not look as bloated as before. Bliss roared angrily at the female elf, and 14 peculiar scorpions crawled out of his body. These scorpions were only the size of a fingernail at first, but when they left Bliss's body, they immediately swelled to the size of bulls and crawled towards the female elf on the metal deck. However, before Bliss could retaliate against the female elf, tens of oddly dressed elves jumped onto the airship and roared as they charged at him. Halfway through their charge, the oak staves in the hands of these strange elves flashed with green light. Amidst a burst of mist, their bodies transformed into violent earth bears and fire wolves as they pincer attacked Bliss. The 14 scorpions and the large group of druids immediately clashed on the airship's deck. The sword dancers and druids had already appeared, and the flower elves, who had the most number of elves, were naturally not to be left behind. This was a group of flower fairies that were only the size of 2 palms and had cicada-like thin wings on their backs. They looked like miniature versions of female elves. Their curvaceous bodies were not clothed, only relying on some entangling vines to cover their vital parts. Their skin was green, their hair was green, and their eyes were a strange black. These flower fairies were a kind of nature attribute monster. Their attack method was their fast flying speed and terrifying claws. There was no doubt that their claws contained a deadly poison, The magus that could transform into insects did not seem to be easy to deal with. These flower elves, who bullied the weak and feared the strong, targeted the female magus who was lying on the ground on her last breath. It was a pity that there was a tall flame demon standing there, spewing flames all over his body. Any flower elf that entered within 50 meters of him would wail miserably as their bodies spontaneously combusted. This immediately frightened the flower elves, causing them to fly around the tall flame demon like a swarm of hornets. However, they did not dare to charge into the faint layer of flames. That flame demon is a rank 2 magus. I'll go deal with him. You try to get rid of this big insect. Isaac yelled at the female elf captain, and led 7 or 8 druids towards Grim. The female elf captain looked at the tall flame demon that Grim had transformed into with a solemn expression. Her heart was unusually heavy. They had killed a female magus and heavily injured another. It seemed like this was a glorious battle, but the surviving magi were getting more and more difficult to deal with. If a few fellows of the same strength came out of the airship, today's battle would probably, however, just as she was thinking, the 10 battle magic machines had already formed a dense formation and began to charge at the elves. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.